Fantastic, great. Well, it is just our honor again to have such a great showing for the 2021 NEMSIS V3 annual implementation meeting. Just fantastic. Well over 200 people have signed up as attendees, and we expect that large of a group. So thank you so much for your continued support of NEMSIS and our efforts to always improve what we do and provide a better experience for our providers that are in the field providing such excellent care. So thank you for joining us. A couple of housekeeping things just quickly, just a reminder that these sessions are being recorded and they'll be shared on the NEMSIS website for future reference. Please, if you are a vendor or a state, we'd love you to update your name in the participation list and add your affiliation. You just click on the three little dots by your name, and that would allow you to rename your name and affiliation as it shows up on the screen for folks. I'll also just mention that if we were to have some major issue with Zoom, MS Teams, Microsoft Teams is our backup platform. And if there's a problem, we will notify you through email, and we'll send all those who have registered for the meeting with the connection information through Teams. So again, a pleasure to have you here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Want to just, hopefully folks have a copy of the agenda. Julianne, perhaps we could put the agenda out on chat if we could potentially do that. You'll notice for the meeting, we've really split up our topics for discussion into three broad categories. Today, the first day here, August 3rd, we will be concentrating on kind of a national perspective, what we have experienced this last year that's just been so incredibly busy and hard for all of us. We'll have a national perspective in regards to where we are with that and really the lessons learned, right? We've was talking to Eric Cheney this morning about kind of where we are in this process. There's really, I don't feel like anybody feels like there's really been an opportunity to come back from what's happened yet in 2020. We've only had a chance to catch our breath, and hopefully we can talk about some of the lessons that are learned and some of the future directions that we'll find incredibly valuable, I think, just based on the experience. So national perspective today, also a legal perspective. Ryan Stark and others from Page, Wolfberg, and Work will be talking about a number of issues, including a number of products that they've provided out this past year. Day two, we will talk mostly about our HIE efforts. How can we improve our ability to exchange our data? Talk a little bit about compliance as well. And then on day three, on August 5th, we'll talk really about moving forward, as I mentioned. How can we move forward with lessons learned and make our product more incredibly valuable at the field level and at the state level and at the national level? We really have had a lot of opportunities, I think, that could be incredibly valuable. Some of the rules of engagements, just to mention briefly, as with this really is our opportunity to really look at the underbelly of NEMSIS. What are we doing well? We're doing a lot incredibly well, but we're not going to concentrate on that. We can pat ourselves on the back later. This is really an opportunity for us to kind of delve into what we still need to improve, what needs to be done to move us forward. For that to happen, we need to kind of lay aside our market mindsets, both for vendors and for states, right? Clearly, as we talk about these things, you need to evaluate their value to you and how you would implement, but we need to work together as really a stakeholder group to make the industry move forward. So yeah, we're going to concentrate on our flaws and our shortcomings and our bottlenecks, and we're going to ask for your opinions and your ideas and why it isn't working. We probably, just because of the time frame, will only have a chance to have you provide us with these overarching ideas as to how we might be able to solve a really difficult problem. But that's what we do at this meeting. And then we spend the entire next year digging into those ideas on our bi-monthly implementation calls. So that'll be a great opportunity for us to do that. So really, we're focusing on strategies potential paths forward for areas where we have determined there's additional work that we could do that would improve the value of NEMSIS. So that is our rules of engagement. So again, we're very, very happy to have you all here. I'm going to go ahead and move forward in the agenda to keep us moving forward. Would like to introduce Dr. John Cromer with the Office of EMS at NHTSA. He will be our first speaker. I'm looking forward to hearing his comments, and he'll be followed by Mr. Eric Cheney, also the Office of EMS. So Dr. Cromer, go ahead.
Thank you, Clay. I appreciate the introduction, laying the ground rules for what will be, I'm sure, a great meeting. If we can move over to the next slide deck period. Good morning, folks, and really thank you all for being here. Looking at the list of attendees, it really is remarkable, not only in terms of the number of participants, but of who the participants are. And as Clay alluded to, we're looking forward to this meeting being an exchange of information and really get information back from you all. A great discussion over the next 3 days. The next slide, please. As Clay mentioned, I'm John Kramer. I'm the director of the Office of EMS, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. I'm also the EMS medical director for the Department of Emergency Services in Caroline County, Maryland. No specific conflicts to report other than a very significant bias in terms of the need for quality EMS data and for the services that NEMSIS provides. Next slide, please. You all may have heard there's an impending retirement in place. I'll be leaving federal service the end of November, but look to continue to follow you all in retirement. I can't reinforce to you all how important NEMSIS and EMS data issues are to me personally and to the NHTSA Office of EMS and to you all, quite frankly, as evidenced by your participation here. I also need to acknowledge the incredibly talented staff that we have at the TAC. You know, it's easy to say we have a contract with the University of Utah to run the Technical Assessment Center. Folks, this is much more than a contract. The folks at the TAC are not only talented and very adept at what they're doing, but they're committed to what they're doing and have dedicated a lot of resources to continue the growth and evolution of the TAC. You know, we'll be talking later today. We've heard from many of you that folks are interested in more output from the NEMSIS program in general, and particularly as it relates to the data that we have access to. And we're working on that. We're working very aggressively on that. Much of, I think, what the community receives in benefit from NEMSIS, however, is really behind the scenes. The database is critical, without doubt, to helping us improve clinical care around the country. But all of the other components of the NEMSIS program, the total information system, is really critical. And we'll be talking about all of those and various ways that we're trying to impact all of those. Folks have probably heard of the Brookings Institute. You know, when we talk about NEMSIS and we talk about EMS data, we typically talk about it in the context of EMS itself. But I want to share with you something that was recently released by the Brookings Institute. This is a nonprofit public policy organization based in DC with a mission to conduct in-depth research, to helping to identify new ideas for solving problems at the local, national, and really global levels. They have experts in the numbers of hundreds in government and academia from all over the world that look at issues of high quality research and policy recommendations and analysis and things like that. This is a report that is not directly related to EMS, as you can tell by the title, Improving the Government Response to the Next Unemployment Crisis. So we're talking about how to address unemployment issues. But as is demonstrated in the next slide, there is a unbelievably, from my perspective, powerful reference in this document to NEMSIS, and holds NEMSIS out to be an example of a data standard and data collecting framework that supports storing patient care data and a common system that is used throughout the country. You've heard Eric and Clay and other folks make note in the past that NEMSIS is really the only healthcare information system of its kind, in that everybody in the country that's involved in EMS clinical care uses the standard and provides data based on the data elements to help share that story. The Brookings Institute talks about a danger that policymakers may focus on one-off investments in data collection, data exchange, and data use. One of the things that we have talked about time and time again, and one of the underlying tenets of the NEMSIS system. So, you know, the rest of the stuff in the Brookings Institute reports talks about unemployment issues and things like that. But it was amazing to us that they capitalized on the work that NEMSIS has done and used that in a very positive manner to identify a good system. When we talk about NEMSIS, the points are really outlined on the next slide, and I've kind of alluded to that already. But we're looking at the entire system, the entire information system. And admittedly, the database is very critical at local levels and regional levels and state levels and at the national level. But the other components that form the underpinning are really the valuable parts of the system. The documentation standard, as you all know, you know, there are some minimal variations across states and from agency to agency, but by and large, the data standard that we have is the standard across the country. You can't do it without the data element dictionary to make sure that everybody understands what they're alluding to. The compliance testing, from my perspective, is really one of the extremely critical hidden parts of the information system. Because when folks go out to a vendor and they identify a compliant vendor, one that meets the NEMSIS standards, you know that the system that you're getting will provide the data to allow you to generate important information that can be transferable between agencies and between systems and between states. And all of that is based on the interoperability and opportunities that standard provides to us. We have been working, as Eric will be talking about shortly, much more on interoperability and exchange standards to be able to help facilitate the exchange of our information, not only between agencies, between states and organizations, but with other components of the healthcare system, whether that be directly with an institution or through health information exchanges and those mechanisms. The next slide is really where we put Eric on the spot, because Eric and I have talked a lot about these issues. I have to give him and the TAC an unbelievable amount of credit, because they really have a vision for this whole process and have been working very aggressively in figuring out ways that we can most appropriately work on that vision to make this whole process more effective. First and foremost, it's got to be easier for the clinicians in the field using the whatever EPCR they have to be able to appropriately reflect the patient care that they provided in a way that is not overly cumbersome. We still have some variation from systems to systems and agencies to agencies and states to state. Selfishly, at the federal level, that does make things a little bit challenging. We noticed during the pandemic the need for much more consistent and timely surveillance information. And to the extent that we can continue as a community working forward and eliminating as much of the variation as possible, that makes the entire system much stronger. You all are well aware, as are we, the stress that states are currently faced with, both from a staff perspective and a financial perspective. And we've got to figure out ways of providing additional resources to help support the state data systems, the state data managers, to allow you to do all the work that you need to. And that's something that Eric continues to beat home to me every time we talk. Focusing on value, I'm hoping that is sort of inherently evident, but we've got to make sure that what we're doing is cost efficient, time efficient, and output effective. Meeting the needs of the services, that's an extension in my mind of making it easier for the field clinicians to be able to do this. And then one of the things that, again, in my mind has been reinforced as a result of the pandemic, we've got to continue to work on resources at the national level to be able to reflect EMS activities and EMS needs when we're faced with, like we are now, the public health emergency. There has been so much information requested of us that looks not only at the overall national perspective, but that looks at, we're hearing that the healthcare system in Region 5 is really stressed right now. What is EMS experiencing? And to be able to look down at issues that Region 5 is facing. I'm talking about the HHS and FEMA regions now when I refer to that, but look at what Region 5 is experiencing. And then, well, is it worse in Indiana, or is it worse in Michigan, or is it worse in Ohio? Now, we understand the sensitivity of the information that you all share with us, but we need to continue to work on being able to get more data, more granular data up to be able to really meet the needs that the EMS community has. So those are Eric's marching orders on a day-to-day basis. Again, thank you so much for joining us. I'm unfortunately going to be in and out over the course of the meeting. Assuming that things don't change between now and tomorrow, I'm going to be hopping on a plane and going to one of the hotbed states, wearing my N95 mask the entire time I'm out. But I look forward to the discussion. And with the direction that I've given you, Eric, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Thanks, Dr. Kramer. You can go to the next slide, please. So good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Eric Cheney. I, as Dr. Kramer said, work for him as an EMS specialist in the NHTSA Office of EMS. And like him, I have no conflicts of interest in that I have no stock in any of the EPCR companies or any organizations associated with this. Next slide, please. What I really want to focus on, and we're going to see this slide over and over and over again from here on out to the point where you get tired of it. What I've learned in NEMSIS is these are the NEMSIS data facts. Everybody wants more data. Most want a specific data set to meet their unique needs. Many want that data collected right now. Few have the resources to support it. No one wants to pay for it. And all of these requests mean that additional work is going to have to be completed by the state data managers, the EMS agencies, the EPCR vendors, and most important, the EMS clinicians actually entering the data. Next slide, please. I'd like to go back to where we started very quickly, 1969. Many of you may have seen this slide before. I have used it in the past. It was May, the American Academy of Orthopedic Surgeons met in Chicago. There was a paper titled Emergency Medical Services Recommendations for an Approach to an Urgent National Problem. Sounds familiar. The author was Peter Safar, and he basically wrote that a national not electronic at the time, a national information system for EMS was essential, not specifically for EMS, but to have a record of the care provided pre-hospital to be included in the patient care report at the hospital. It also specified that there was a need to recognize that some of these reports would be short and some of them, like cardiac arrest, would require additional information. Next slide, please. So fast forward to where we are today, almost 52 years later, the 2020 NEMSIS public release data set with all of the data from 2009 has over 250 million EMS activations submitted by 12,000 plus EMS agencies serving now 51 states. Next slide, please. What that means to you is that you all should be extremely proud of the work that you've done. Whether you're an EPCR vendor, large, small, state systems, one locality, whether you're the data manager, the public health director, the state director, the EMS clinician in the field, most importantly, you should take pride in your part in developing the system that we have today. Next slide, please. So what's the future look like? That's part of the title of this presentation, and we're going to hit on some things at a very high level, and then one or two of the other presentations that I have throughout the next couple of days will provide additional information on specific projects. The first I want to mention is the migration of NEMSIS to the DOT AWS cloud environment. This is a federal requirement required by the Department of Transportation. It's no reflection on the University of Utah or NEMSIS. It's part of the federal government's process of bringing all data in under their sort of guise. The data submission process, we're working with AWS, the University of Utah, and by the end of this year, phase one, as we refer to it, should be complete, and that we would have the current data from NEMSIS would be located in a .gov AWS, or I'm sorry, in a government cloud AWS environment. So what does phase two look like? Phase two would be looking at the website, nemsis.org, looking at what's required to make it a .gov, and meeting all of the security, the legal, the branding, so on and so forth requirements established by the federal government, and making that move over the next appropriate timeline. And then finally having the entire process be a part of the overall DOT cloud environment. So that's an ongoing project. somewhat behind the scenes, we realize there are a lot of moving pieces. There'll be a lot of impacts to vendors when we start to look at the .gov website and permissions and data access and submissions. So more to come on that. I want to mention that the data that we collect is used by a lot of federal agencies now, and COVID has essentially stepped up that usage. The FDA is interested in monitoring medication effects in the pre-hospital setting, and we have worked with them and continue to currently work with them on a couple different projects. CMS, the University of Utah and the NEMSIS TAC has a contract with them now to look at linking EMS and Medicaid claims data to basically look at outcomes to see if what Medicaid is paying for is appropriate for the care provided by EMS. And patient outcomes is a part of that, and how that fits into the healthcare spectrum. So one of the biggest topics, and it was on my charge list from Dr. Kramer, and it was number one at the top of the list for a reason, is to ease the burden of data collection. And we've started through that process. Obviously, technology makes some things easier in that you can scan it, you don't have to type it in. Or if you've entered 2 pieces of data, that suffices for the next 10. There are all sorts of different ways to approach it, but things that we can do is look at defined lists, for example. We've identified that defined lists got out of control for whatever reason, and we have to scale that back because a provider is not going to look through 6 different levels to find a specific thing, such as struck by duck or bitten by orca as a reason for trauma. So those are some things that we can do at the TAC, and we can do that by listening to our clinicians and vendors to basically ease some of the burden of data collection, which is the number one complaint that I hear when we have field level providers in any of our groups. So next slide, please. What are some other things that we can do to improve? So we had this conversation a week and a half ago now about timelines for versions, and that comes up quite frequently. We also have frequent conversations with other, whether it's an NGO related to EMS or healthcare or other federal agencies who want more data. They want to add NEMSIS data elements. They want the next version. They're talking about 3.6. We saw in COVID the need to immediately make some modifications to collect things. We were a little slow in that. States recognized, in some cases, localities recognized they wanted to capture specific COVID data immediately, so they created their own elements. Bottom line is we need to find a way to make the system more agile. And I realize we're trying to turn an aircraft carrier, but we need to find a way to make that happen. Decreasing submission times. In COVID, data that came in 90 days late was interesting, but not really helpful for planning purposes for what we were trying to respond to. And that data is not just about patients, it's about the operation as well. It's about how many ambulances were available, the staffing shortages, why were the staffing shortages happening, what happened to the individual that they couldn't come to work, were they now COVID infected? Were they having a mental or behavioral health issue? Were they taking care of family? All of that is extremely important in how we manage what resources we provide to an area when something like COVID happens. And as we go into what we're looking at currently with the current deviations, how are we responding differently this time? I mentioned, or Dr. Kramer mentioned, variation. I am always a fan of eliminating redundancy. We did a kind of a scan of states, and we found that in a few states, they actually asked the same question twice. We thought that was kind of interesting. It appeared in different places in EPCR, but it was possible for an EMS personnel to see one question more than once. Increase the ability and frequency of updates I mentioned, and I don't know if it's increasing the versions and updates more frequently or just creating a system that allows for updates to be made and then How do we eliminate that variation when we make them very quickly? So all of those things are on my list. The key to all of this, quite frankly, is resources, money, and personnel. And Dr. Kramer undersold that every time I have a meeting with leadership, whether it's him or his boss or our leadership at NHTSA, the number one thing on my list is to point out the funding. And my first goal at funding is to the state level, to the state data managers who are paying for the resources that the versions here are that the vendors here are taking, or, are using to support their organizations. It's not TAC funding. I recognize that the NEMSIS TAC budget has been flat. It's a congressional specific amount of money given to them every year, and then we try to find some monies to support that. But I'm being very honest with you when I say that that money right now is enough to keep us very busy. The money and resources, whether it's finding a way to put personnel in regions to support states, or whether it's actual dollars to the actual states, that's where the focus needs to be. Next slide, please. So the barriers to success, and again, we're not limited by technology. I'm not trying to offend anybody in the room because I'm not a technology giant. I don't claim to be, and I never will be, but we are not doing anything that I see currently technology challenges any of the technological features of NEMSIS or data collection. Our biggest challenges seem to be, one, resources, and diverse directions. The HIE pieces, all of the vendors I talk to, not all of them, most of the vendors I talk to, we have a way to do this. It's almost like the old days we were buying cardiac monitors. Not only do we have a way to do it, we have the best way to do this. Our way works better than others. When in fact, a lot of different ways work, but we can't build islands of success just because we were able to capitalize on something in one large metropolitan area of the country doesn't mean that it's expandable throughout the United States. And we're also always trying to get direction from clinicians, medical directors, state directors, and data managers. I put the two bullets at the bottom. I should have bolded those in red and made them flash or something. I am always available to address concerns. I have vendors that I talk to that they'll call me, send me an email. Hey, can we talk about something? I have local data managers that I talk to. Unfortunately, it seems like it's the same ones over and over. I cannot emphasize enough in one of my other presentations, my cell phone number's in there. You're more than welcome to call me. I'm on the East Coast. I'm happy to discuss any concerns or things that you think we can do to make NEMSIS better. Next slide, please. So I want to go back to this Brookings report just to kind of build off of this. And this just came out in July, so it was very timely. I thought it was interesting there, one quote about the Federalist devotion of authority and UI and other labor systems to states creates an unsustainable need for each state to build a wholesale custom system rather than being able to achieve economies of scale and reduce costs by sharing system components or software services. So when I think of things, folks, I tend to think in national and regions. I respect and understand the states. I know that state budgets define what's spent. State laws define how things are collected and where they go. But at the end of the day, the most frustrating part of my job is watching 3 or 4 states struggle to do the same thing. So whenever I can do something with one of the EPCR vendors on this call, build it out so that you guys can roll it out to multiple entities that you work with and don't have to, I'm not trying to take your business away, but don't have to charge each one of them for independent development. To me, that's a huge win for me. Next slide, please. So timing is critical. Planning is essential. And I want to make sure that everybody understands what that is, because I don't think a lot of people understand how this federal spigot of money flows. In fact, even working in it, sometimes it's confusing. So what you need to know for planning purposes, when Clay and I talk about things for the TAC, what's going on today is important. But in terms of federal planning, it was over a year ago. Tomorrow is important. What do you need next month? What do you need next year? NEMSIS focus is on the federal budget cycle. So we have already done 2021's budget. We've looked at 2022, and 2023 is under consideration. What that means to you is anything NEMSIS related, I'm looking at my crystal ball and I'm saying, what are we going to be doing in 2023 that is important to NEMSIS? How much money will we need, and where will that money need to go? To the TAC, to the states, which is my priority. Are the states going to be funding software development? Where's version 3.5 in all this? And these are the things that I'm thinking about when we're having these meetings and I'm listening to people have asks or needs. Next slide, please. Again, take you back to Brookings, not to beat this like a dead horse, but the resource limitations. I thought it was just so interesting how we think of things in healthcare, and EMS is a part of healthcare. These folks are talking about education, but it's the same thing. Now that more public sector leaders have bought into it, everyone seems to want digital transportation, and they want it now. With the lack of resources and lack of overarching data and security framework are barriers to the public sector deployment, and so on. So again, it's across different walks of life, different environments, but it's the same thing. Next slide, please. Are we always going to be successful? And you can go to the next slide. And the answer to that is no. We're going to miss. Sooner or later, you're going to make a mistake. And one of the things, and I remember this from an EMS field provider perspective, we used to talk about it as EMS field providers would eat their young. And that was, if you've never been in the field, and I know some of you aren't field providers, what it meant was we were not very friendly and kind to the new EMS personnel coming up. So what does that have to do with NEMSIS? Well, when new ideas and new thoughts and new things come out, we need to take a look at them. We need to consider them. And then when we do get some sort of national basis and start and framework, it's not going to meet everybody's needs. It's not going to meet every unique data request. One of the things I think is interesting from the folks at DOT and others, we had a data request here the other week and they wanted crash data, and they were not upset, but they were kind of disappointed that we didn't have the actual spot that the patient was riding in when the motor vehicle crash occurred for every one of the crash activations. So, that's an example. The system wasn't designed for that. It was oriented around patient care. But we can give you crash data. We just can't tell you where they were in a car. So inconsistent data sharing is another piece, and we're going to talk about that more. Data use agreements, we are underway. You're going to hear from Paige Wolfberg and Worth. We're working with them on our data use agreement project to revisit those for version 3.5 and look more specifically at operational level and surveillance data. Next slide, please. The ramifications of not having the standardization and not having the availability to do a deeper dive into this data means that, just like the data request I mentioned on crash data, the public and government reporting, it's stifled. And the corporate entities, we have some of those out there, 3 or 4 now, that are using this EMS data, and even the national data set, they're selling your work. So we need to figure out a way to better manage that. And the reason that this is important is that the federal agencies are interested, involved, and they have buy-in. Think about the funding piece. That makes it easy to go after the money and put that money where it's important, where the data is being collected. Next slide, please. One of the things that I've tried to do with NEMSIS to get around some of the things I heard when I first started is, a monthly report for transparency purposes. Here are the projects we're working on. Here are the conferences, the meetings we're supporting. It's interesting now, one of the other things that's happened with the virtual world is that our meetings are all now recorded. Not all of them. The bulk of them are recorded. Many of our meetings are posted on nemsis.org for you to go back and listen to, just like this one will be. So what was said? What was important? What did Eric commit to? What did he not commit to? Those are the things that we've tried to do at the TAC to make sure you understand just what we're doing and where we're going. And if you disagree, we like to hear it. You're not going to hurt my feelings, I promise you. Next slide, please. We created 2 SME groups. Next slide, please. An internal and external group. I'll start with the external. There's the big picture folks. They're really looking at things like, should we be using the fast healthcare interoperability resources, the FHIR standard? How should we be integrating with ONC? And we're going to talk more about that this afternoon. Hospital data exchanges, sort of the big external issues, not focusing on data. Next slide. The internal board we put together is the group that we've asked to focus on the actual data piece itself. They get down into the weeds. They produced a list for me at the last meeting, 3 pages long, that has all sorts of different thoughts and recommendations, some of which would be doable, some of which probably would not be doable in my lifetime. But they're looking at across the spectrum to say, unlimited by resources, what are some of the possibilities? I asked them to, and we'll talk again more about these this afternoon, to rank their priorities and give me sort of the top 2 or 3. It was interesting. So some of the things that were discussed: hosting data, transition to AWS, which I mentioned at DOT, customer ticketing system. That's an internal thing, but very specific to the NEMSIS TAC, developing a way to track requests because we're getting more and more. And of course, everybody needs it right now. And, somebody's going to be disappointed. This shouldn't be anything that's not familiar to any of the EPCR vendors on the call. Every time someone picks up the phone, they need it and they need it now. Agency performance reports based on NEMSQA measures, looking at quality, looking at outcome. Where's that fall in the importance? And then improving agency submission lag. So how do we get data from the actual field clinician to the local level, from the local level to the state level, and then state to the federal, and not have a 90-day, 60-day, 30-day lag. Revisiting state data use agreements, and then NEMSIS version 3.5 migration, the educational tools and support work for that. And it was interesting, this internal group, they targeted improving agency submission lag as number 1, customer ticketing as number 2, and this version 3 migration tools as number 3. And I'll show you the conflict. In my mind, the hosting data for DOT and the AWS migration is my number 1 priority. And then revisiting state data use agreements is my number 2. So this afternoon, we're going to talk more about prioritization and value. And it's very interesting because it really depends on who you are when you're looking at a particular topic or product. Next slide, please. I mentioned keeping states in the loop. Again, another thing that we did, this was back in October, but we're doing this on all our state director calls now that we have with ET3, is providing an update on COVID and also putting in a little bit of what we're doing, big ticket items with NEMSIS. Next slide, please. The work with ONC, we're going to talk more about this afternoon as well. Looking at the HL7 FHIR, bidirectional data flow with hospitals. How do we promote that? What data are we going to be requesting for hospitals? My favorite conversation, and Clay and I have been in the room for a couple of these now with health, with the actual EMS clinicians or the agency level folks are really down in the weeds. We hear the conversation and it goes, we need the data back from the hospital. And Clay and I look at one another and smile and ask the question, what data would you like back? Well, all of it. Really? Do you want everything that happened to this patient in the hospital to come back to you as part of your report? And we start giving examples, and they realize very quickly that they don't need to know the PT steps that the patient had given to them by the ER doctor at discharge. So they really want some specific data elements to come back. And then when they come back, where do they fall in the patient care record? And what does that mean to the actual record itself? We had some people express concerns about, well, that's altering my patient record if we add to that. So we bring in our friends at Page, Wolfberg, and Worth to help us explain how that's really not the case. Next slide, please. Work with ET3. I cannot thank the vendors that have participated in this enough. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been an incredible, in my career in the federal government, having multiple federal agencies and as many local EMS services and EPCR vendors involved. This process is going so smooth, it's almost scary. And I probably just jinxed it. But the fact that out of the 205 original, I believe we're up to 170 some now, have actually gotten data in. We have millions of records that are flowing freely. The bottom line here is NEMSIS has prevented every agency participating from having to go out to their own vendor and basically pay for a setup and transmission and getting all the security keys and everything else that goes with transmitting data to this particular project. Next slide, please. And then, of course, I can't go without mentioning the public view of the data that's available for researchers and others. That's almost a daily question that we get from somebody about that. Next slide, please. State dashboards. These are incredibly helpful, but we're looking at our next step, which is how to take this dashboard from something that a state has to go to or to someone of interest in a state who wants particular data on a topic. They don't have to go look this up. It's basically there for them when they turn their computer on. So how to move this from something you have to go find and see to something that's put in front of your face on a daily basis. That's our next step in looking at dashboard data. I'm not saying we're not going to produce additional ones. It's just saying that we recognize that there could be a more slick technological way to make this data more valuable. Next slide, please. I want to end this part of my presentation and just mention the Federal Health IT Strategic Plan is something that I don't think you heard about a whole lot probably 3 years ago, but it has become more important. The Office of the National Coordinator within HHS, we have been working hand in hand with them to try to make sure that EMS and NEMSIS data is included in there, and for us to understand how we can better position it so that it is included. Next slide, and I'll give you an example. If you went back to Vision 2050 to the document, it talked about the missing pieces, the actual clinician, the actual community, and the actual patient that were not included in that original circular diagram of what an EMS system looked like. And we talked about how our NEMSIS system is going to have to support those three entities. And when we look at what the Federal Health IT Interoperability Roadmap includes, it is very straightforward that it includes the public, the practice, which in this case is our agency and clinician, and the patient themselves. So we're not far off. Actually, it wasn't planned that way, but we're not far off in our vision for EMS in the future in the 2050 document in the Federal Health IT Interoperability Roadmap. We just now have to work closely with them to make sure as they build out requirements that EMS is included as a part of that. And I'll stop there. We have, I think, just about a couple minutes if there's a real quick question. If not, we're going to delve into some of these projects a little bit more this afternoon. Thank you all for your time, and please be safe.
Thanks, Eric. We're going to go back over to Clay to talk about the progress from the 2020 annual meeting. And I just want to, as a housekeeping item, remind everyone, if you do have questions, please feel free to type them in the chat. Even if we're not able to answer them real time, we are going to record the chat and work on getting those answers back to everyone. Even if it's after the next 3 days, we're going to make a real effort to do that. So please feel free to type questions in the chat as well. All right, Clay.
All right, thank you, Ben. Thank you, John and Eric. Great comments. Folks know we've been at this for a while, and a number of years, and I'll just mention the commitment of Dr. Kramer and Eric to this project is just, it's unmatched, I think, over the years. And Eric's effort to fund this project appropriately is, I'll also share my comments. it's mentioned almost every single day. And I think some of the lessons that we've learned from the pandemic speak to the idea that we really are very close to meeting the return on investment that the CDC thinks needs to be in place, or the HHS thinks needs to be in place to really provide the substantial funding, really substantial funding that would make NEMSIS an incredibly valuable surveillance system. That's a little bit of a new topic, I think, for NEMSIS. It is a data collection system. It's a data repository system. You can compare it to emergency department data sets, hospital discharge data sets, the ACS trauma registry. But really the idea that we have built a system that allows data to be collected quickly and provided back in a reporting process quickly, and the ability to actually surveil, that has been really our advantage during the pandemic. But we have some processes that need to be revised, or for us to continue to improve, before we can meet that return on investment need that the CDC and others are requesting. And that will be a large part of the discussion, I think, over the next 3 days. Really looking forward to all of you participating in very big ways and sharing what's happened within your states or at the vendor level that was incredibly impactful, and what we can do to increase the usefulness of the data. And just as a final kind of setting the preparatory mark for us to be able to move forward into conversations, is to maybe review what we were able to accomplish since our last V3 implementation meeting in 2020. If we had known what was in front of us at that meeting, it was a very hard, I think, fall and spring for EMS, or a fall and winter. And as I mentioned, I think the spring has brought at least a breath. But we have made great progress, and I would welcome anybody to speak up during this quick presentation of what we covered last year and what we were able to accomplish in midst of the pandemic. If there are things that are missing, if there are ideas that you shared or that you remember or that have come up that you think we need to make sure we cover, please mention them in the chat, or feel free to unmute yourself and share those. I'm happy to be interrupted. I'll then just do a brief introduction to the NEMSIS TAC team. I think most of you know most folks, but I want to make sure that those that are new to the call understand the role that everybody plays, and maybe get a look at their pictures so you'll know who you're potentially talking to. And then we'll take a break, and then we begin to actually delve into the meat of the conversation. So I'll begin just by giving a quick overview of where we were last year and what we've accomplished and what is still remaining, which is highlighted in red in most of these areas. In 2020, we had a great conversation about how we can improve bidirectional data flow. And aside from the issues that I see listed here below, the HL7 CDC and fire versions and things, there was also this idea that there are also political barriers. There's also lack of understanding barriers and educational needs that need to be met. One of the really important topics that was brought up was this idea that hospitals and other entities and HIEs are worried about releasing patient health information to EMS agencies, not thinking that they have the right kind of education or mindset to protect the confidentiality of PHI. I think that is a true statement across the country. And as folks know, we had Eric asked Paige Wolfberg and Worth to put together documents that spoke to how do we overcome, educate this concern, and how do we educate our agencies. And Eric will talk more about this afternoon. But that was incredible work that was accomplished. We also talked about how do we move forward technically. I just mentioned the HL7 work, both on the fire and the CDA standards. And we're actively right now moving forward with the HL7 CDA. We just reapproved the version 4 CDA for moving information from an ambulance to an emergency department. That has been renewed. and has been ANSI approved again for another 5 years. We're currently working with some contractors on that same HL7 CDA for moving that PCR data into the ED for version 5. So that will be available in the spring. It'll be balloted hopefully in the spring. So we're looking forward to completing that. For that same movement of data, exchange of the PCR data into the hospital system, we're also building a FHIR version. That's pretty forward thinking, right? I mean, I don't imagine that we'll really be making those kind of exchanges probably until late 2022, 2023, but that will be available. And then we've had a great outcomes work group who we have been engaging, and we need to be meeting more often with them, and we will be actually. We'll talk about that in a moment. Dr. Greg Mears is going to be helping us with that process. We're building that handshake template and implementation guide in both CDA and FHIR that would improve our ability to make sure that the e-outcome section works for agencies and for states and at the national level. We'll talk more about that on day 2. So that's great work that's underway. We also talked a lot about how are we going to roll out version 3.5, and we're going to be talking at great length about this over the next 3 days. There was requests, hey, we need to have more information guides, infomercials, short videos, things like that would help promote to agencies and the states the moving to version 3.5. We have built a number of those those products, and they're now listed on the NEMSIS website in a new location called NEMSIS 101. There also was a request for us to continue to utilize the map that we have been using for version 3.4 and preparing it for 3.5. So it's there, it's ready to go. And if you click on any state, there's going to be a new set of information related to 3.5 that even includes the additional products. For example, the state data set that's will be available for states. Those will all be filled in as soon as we have some progress towards 3.5. So that's been put in place. Also, best practices. We had a great presentation by Chip Cooper at the boot camp meeting, where he shared a number of best practice documents that he prepared to help states navigate a number of the barriers that are associated with moving to a new version. All that is available on NEMSIS 101, and feel free to access that. And perhaps we need to ask Chip to do another presentation, I think, to that, perhaps to the DMC group. That might be incredibly valuable. What we are planning in the fall is we are partnering with a group that is going to help us with formal multimedia products that are going to be rolled out that will speak specifically to the requirements or the educational needs of 3 audiences: the states, the agencies, and the clinicians, right? So the idea here is, with your help, to be able to design these in a way that directly meet their needs and help the agencies and states be able to make this process of moving to 3.5 much smoother. So as a good example, that we've made some massive changes to e-disposition, and where e-disposition 12 is replaced by 3 mandatory required elements, and or excuse me, 4 mandatory and required elements and 1 additional optional element. How can we best share that information? So our idea is for the clinicians to actually work with you as vendors and develop short video clips that describe how you would take a traditional call and indicate the disposition for that call using their software product. What are you going to click? What are you going to click to replace the e-disposition 12 method with the new 4-element method, and actually provide them with a how to do this when you're in the field. For the agencies, our idea for that very same topic is to develop materials that talk about the value added. Why go from 1 element to 4? how does this allow you to now more appropriately capture dispositions that were incredibly hard to correctly capture under e-disposition 12? And at the state level, to understand how are we going to modify our schematron files. E-disposition 12 was a key element associated with many, many business rules in schematron file. How are we best going to make that transition? How can we look at migrations of current schematron rules to version 3.5? So those are the kind of very specific products that we hope to start building and providing in a multi media fashion over the fall. So those are kind of our ideas moving forward. We'll have a great presentation provided by Laurie later on that topic, so you can add your comments to those ideas. We have been talking a lot about this idea of releasing geographic identifiers. How are we going to do this in a way that works, right? How can the expectations of states in regards to how NEMSIS data is released to researchers or to the CDC or to HHS, how can we modify that in ways that makes our data valuable? Eric was very kind when he talked about the data going to HHS and CDC and how that worked. I'll tell you, when that was happening early on in the pandemic, when we were developing these SFTP sites for them to receive data on a daily basis, there was incredible excitement about this idea of having real-time data coming in with really having pretty complete information about a geographic region within just 2 weeks, right? Really being able to keep track of influenza-like illness across the country. Here, these records are coming in daily, they're getting the records. But when the CDC and HHS realized that they did not really have the capacity to geocode, to map where each of those cases were coming from, even at a county level or even at a state level, the interest diminished immediately. And the idea of the return on investment for us immediately dropped. So we really do need to solve this issue and find a way to actually make this work. We have talked about this for probably 2 years and have got lots of information from states and from vendors. And we plan to go to NEMSIS this fall with an implementation plan. It's basically going to represent a new paragraph that's going to be present in the version 3.5 data use agreement that's available on the NEMSIS website that we'd like states to consider implementing. And it's going to talk about releasing just basically symptoms or impressions or things that describe time-sensitive issues at a county level, and providing the self-suppression that the data use the data managers indicated would be valuable for states to be able to be assured that an individual case may not be identified within a county, and ensuring that that works by time period, right? So if people are looking daily at a county, right, we need to make sure that self-suppression works, whether the data is daily or aggregated at a weekly level, or for weekly stats or monthly stats, so that will happen. The measurement's going to be activations. We're not going to try to capture the number of people who are experiencing ILI symptoms. That's just not reliable within the NEMSIS standard the way it is. It will remain to be activation. So that's what's going to be happening. We'll help you understand that better as we go through this meeting as well. Probably, as Eric mentioned, really one of our shining moments during the heat of the pandemic last fall and into the early spring, all through winter, was getting ET3 up and running. How incredible that was. And he's right. We have CMS now has well over 7 million records. 5 million of those are historical. 2 million are coming in on a daily basis and actually speak to the research questions that they hope to be able to look at, the new funding questions. 140 agencies sending in data on a regular basis, right? With 170 who've been brought on. So great, incredible progress there. And maybe I'll just share just a very quick note there. to really bring to light the importance of this, of the work that you accomplished. You'll remember that early on in the pandemic with the last administration, there was this freeing up of allowing EMS to be reimbursed for sending patients to alternative locations, specifically temporary expansion locations, right? Where they were sending patients with influenza-like illness symptoms until they were tested for COVID. And then if they had COVID, perhaps remaining in those sites. So there was a process that was put in place. CMS called it the CMS Hospital Without Walls. And there was talk. There was, for several weeks and months, there was talk about let's just quit ET3. Let's just turn that project off, because the administration has cleared this process to happen under emergency declaration. We'll go ahead and allow for these alternate destinations. And then when it comes time to turn off that emergency declaration, we'll just turn it off. Well, what that would have left us with is exactly the same thing coming out of the pandemic that we have now, with no additional progress made towards reimbursing EMS for treatment in place or transport to alternate destinations. And it was truly, it was Eric's voice, and it was the voices at CMMI within ET3 that said, whoa, hey guys, this is working. We're getting the data. The data's coming in right now. We were able to jumpstart this thing quickly. We have data coming in for ET3. Please don't shut this down. We can continue with this. It came very close to that happening. And it really was clearly the efforts of the vendors and the states to move this forward in light of the pandemic and making that data flow that allowed this project to survive. So really, that was an incredible success for us, and it will be an incredible success for us in helping EMS to be recognized for what they actually do and reimbursed for the care that they provide. That's the power of NEMSIS, being able to provide that data quickly in a surveillance type process that allows either research questions or surveillance to happen near real time, right? We won't ever be real time, but we will be much closer to real time than any other data registry that you can find across the country. So that has been incredibly valuable. We also have to talk more about the defined list. Eric brought this up, made a great point about this. It continues to provide some incredible issues for our providers in increasing the efficiency of their process. Eric and I had a chance to present at a Zoll conference just recently. And there was chat that was brought in by many providers that were actually on that session that said, hey, these lists are so hard to get through. They're so complex. It takes so much time to go through this list to figure out how to do this. And that doesn't speak to just the implementation that Zoll's provided, right? That speaks to the lists that the states want to see, or the lists that the agencies want to see, right? And now that we refined these lists into these shorter lists, we need to come up with a way to somehow have that captain in that EMS agency who they've worked to build their list. I know it's hard. They've worked hard to make sure the list covers what they want. How are we going to get them to review a new list? How are we going to get them to take what they've got, look at the new list and see how it differs and what they want to add, what they want to subtract? That is going to be a big process for us to figure out. And Julianne has some ideas there that will be incredibly helpful. We have made great progress based on comments that you provided last year for 2020. You wanted a hosting platform, right, that allowed you to download the list in a more digestible and automated fashion. So that is happening. We're in the midst of developing those processes, so those lists are available in XML, JSON, and in Excel, right? So they're more readable, and so diffs can be done, right? So Josh has this vision of allowing vendors to be able to do diffs based on this more program readable data. So that will be incredibly helpful. We have a plan that we'll be introducing to you this fall as to how we're going to review these lists. How can How can we build a process where if a state or an agency says, hey, we need a new code to cover this new issue, do we just allow that kind of Wild West approach to continue to happen? Or can we have a really facile process where an agency could make a request to a state, the state could make sure that we know about it, and there's a quick conversation to ensure that if that same request comes in from another agency or from another state, that we can make sure that that same code is used across the country. And we'll talk more about that, but I think there's great progress that can be made with a very mobile, quick way of reviewing the lists. And then, as Eric mentioned, the submission lag. We need to crack this nut, folks. I think the timeliness of our data was incredibly valuable, and I would love to hear the stories within your states as how you were able to track ILI symptoms across your state and map those or correlate those with hospitalizations or with deaths. We've seen some incredible work come by us, right? At a city level or a state level that shows these incredible correlations between what EMS saw 2 weeks ago and what is reported for deaths or hospital admission months after when that data is aggregated. So it really is this bellwether as to community health that could be incredibly valuable. But we have to see if we can work on that submission lag. And we spent some time. You've seen we've cataloged what are the state requirements or expectations currently for data submission. Some of those have been recently modified and are very rapid turnaround times that are expectations. Others within states, I think, have been the same for a very long time, perhaps even when there were paper forms and agencies don't feel the need to be a little bit more quickly reviewing their data and feeling comfortable submitting records and feel like they have 60 days to get it done right, or even longer than that in some states. So we've done that. We've talked to vendors about what are their practices for holding onto records before they come to the national level. We have a lot of information that we've gathered. Now it's time to prioritize those expectations, those ideas, those practices, determine which ones we can modify or change with education or with technology that could be incredibly valuable. We do need to recognize that our return on investment for states or for the federal level and even for agencies is going to be our ability to surveil. It's just going to be the case. And so we need to work hard on that. And then just finally, during the 2020 meeting, we did talk about the new compliance process that would be in place for version 3.5. We provided many more resources related to that process here so that we have multiple FTEs that are helping you as vendors to move through this process very quickly. We've streamlined the process and test cases. We've improved the CTA application for you to receive more feedback when you submit test records. So hopefully you've found that valuable. And we've built kind of a probation and kind of an appeal process for staying on track with compliance. And actually had, as we were implementing this new idea, had several software products that actually moved into probation, but every single one of them moved out of probation, right? So it worked. We provided the additional resources and time that was necessary to bring them on board. The Office of EMS was happy with that probation process. Actually, Eric was very helpful in defining that, and it worked out great. We didn't lose anybody. Everybody came back into compliance. So that was an incredible success. But now it's time to talk about, is this process working? For those of you that have gone through it, what was working about it? What wasn't working as well as you'd like? Are there additional revisions that we should consider? And we've been receiving feedback from the software companies as they've gone through this. So there is clearly some work that we can accomplish. So I'm gonna stop there just for a quick moment and see if there's any questions or comments. I see Jeff left a comment in the chat. You're going to have to convince the lawyers and the hospitals have consulted in order to get over their reluctance to share data with EMS. Such a great comment, Jeff, and it speaks to my first comment, right, about what PWW has done just for a product that's been provided out. I'll mention to you, Jeff, and others that this is also a key point that Dr. Greg Mears, that's leading the consultant development of the fire tools and the CDA tools. In addition to those technical products that we need to provide, Greg has this really great vision, and he'll be talking about it during this meeting as well, about dealing with these reluctancies, right, on the state side or on the hospital side or on the HIE side for the sharing of data. How do we address those? How do we best address those? So that is built into his work that he plans to accomplish for the rest of this year and into next. So yeah, great comment. Any other comments?
Hi, Clay. This is Kelly with Image Trend.
Hi, Kelly.
Hello. I guess as far as compliance testing goes, I think the process is actually very smooth, and you could tell that you guys put a lot of time into thinking through that process. The only suggestion that I would have is maybe rethink the, or maybe not even rethink, but look at how you guys are requiring the custom fields. It just feels like it's a lot of resources to build these fields that are actually not going to be implemented in real life. So we spend a lot of time building these custom fields and then not actually doing anything with them. And I guess in my experience that there are enough custom fields from states and other resources that we can prove we can build custom fields on the fly. So I think that there could be a better way to implement that and improve that process.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. For state folks who maybe a little bit of background there, right? So part of the compliance testing process is to ensure that these software vendors can implement custom elements. And what we end up doing is in the test cases, there are these just custom fields that are required to be built that really aren't custom fields that are commonly used within the industry. So Kelly's right. I think that process is burdensome, and that they'll build those custom values. That does take time and work to meet the requirements of those test cases that they'll never use, right? So they have to build these things and provide them in a way that we can test that they're in the GUI, that they're available, that they're usable, that the data comes out the back end of that process, but then they just turn them off. They never end up using them. So that's a great comment, Kelly. Yeah, thank you. And we've talked about that. So I think there's some ideas coming on the PyCon on that. So thank you. All right, Keelan had a comment here as well. Can you place the test cases into a state that already has its own custom fields? Then you can just verify those, right? So that's yeah, Keelan, that's exactly the idea that we've been kicking around. How can we provide that process in a way that allows that work to not be wasted, right? For that work to actually build those to work. So this is going to be a great conversation for ATIM and others that's going to be covering this topic. I think tomorrow. So yeah, great comments. Great comments. Other thoughts on any of the other topics or the items in red that we'll be talking about over the course of the next 3 days? These are only some of the topics we'll be covering. There's also some novel ideas that we'll be presenting, but I just want to make sure that I'm not missing any big ticket items that people may remember from next year that they'd like covered. Okay, thank you very much for sharing the chat and for speaking up. That's what makes this meeting so incredibly valuable, is for us to be able to kind of share ideas together. So please feel free to go ahead and share. I'm going to take just a quick minute before a break and just introduce you to the NEMSIS team. This will be kind of our final kind of background piece to get you all excited about participating over the next 3 days. And at the NEMSIS TAC, we try to carve what we do and how we split up resources and responsibilities into 4 pillars. The leadership pillar that kind of ensures that the contractual items that we have with the Office of EMS at NHTSA are being completed on time and to spec. We have a business side where we really put most of our resources. This is where we're working directly with the states, with the state data managers, with the actual providers who contact us, or you as vendors. These are the folks that actually are available to you to help with issues. And we'll walk through some of their responsibilities here just to make sure that folks know who they can contact and who's is the best person to reach out for to kind of ask their question. We also have a research pillar that probably isn't seen a lot by the stakeholder groups that are on this call, but they are incredibly busy. That leads to, as Eric showed in his slides, over 1,000 now peer-reviewed public research articles that are available in Google Scholar using NEMSIS data. They're really cover incredibly important topics. Now, yes, does this, we do research, right? And we do it very well. And we're published in very important journals that I think leads to important changes at the federal level or at the state level, but not, it's hard to make that connection to the EMS provider that's entering that data on a daily basis. But really, this provides the evidence. This provides the evidence of what we do and why we do it and why it's so valuable. So we need to continue to bolster this piece as well and make sure that we're getting out information that allows people to not say, oh, that EMS data isn't worth its weight. It's garbage in, garbage out, or they'll never be able to change that, or you can't affect response times, or I don't know what the response time is. How does anybody know that? Well, those kind of comments that are made at the national level or the state level or a jurisdictional level within a state just aren't possible anymore. There's evidence that can answer a number of questions that can relate directly to funding or to staffing. So we're happy to have these folks that help ensure that our researchers get data that they need. And then of course, the vendor side probably work very closely with the IT and the BI side, right? They do incredible work. Let's take just a moment and introduce folks. I want to introduce folks just real briefly and put faces to names. I'm the principal investigator for NEMSIS. Have been here since at the beginning of the Technical Assistance Center being here at the University of Utah. I took over the reins from the great foundational work that was done by Dr. Greg Mears, and he continued to play an active role for many years, ensuring that our course was straight and that our map was pointed in the right direction. We're really grateful to have him back on the team. We'll be talking more about that. Lisa leads the IT and ops teams that who are developing and maintaining the technical structure and support the data systems. She's the one that's leading the migration into AWS. So she has been incredibly busy with her team making that happen. Most folks know Julianne. She is really the axle that holds the spokes together, right? She's the one that's contacting me on a daily basis. Why don't you have this done, Clay? Right, you're behind, right? So she's the one that ensures that we're meeting our deadlines and allows us to report back to the Office of EMS and to you that we're making progress on requests for assistance and help. The business side team is incredibly rich. Monet is one of our state specialists that has years of experience. She helps the data managers directly with errors and with warnings and with schematron structure issues, with DEM files and more. Lori is our latest new state specialist who is learning from Monet and will be taking the lead working with states and also with the educational resources that we talked about that we'll be rolling out in the fall. So she'll be leading up that work. And then ATIM provides support in regards to compliance testing and navigating that process. Many of you who have gone through the compliance process has worked directly with ATIM, and she also supports the team with project management. And Ben Fisher has been a great addition to our team this year. He's a medic and is uniquely situated to provide industry experience. He leads up much of the research pieces that are going on now, and works very hard to make the EMS data understandable to researchers and to providers, states or federal folks who are requesting the data. There's lots that they have to understand about the nuances of NEMSIS data to make that incredibly valuable. Then Chris, hopefully folks are seeing the value that Chris brings. He's really our media and design expert. He's got talents that he brings to the team that really makes our outreach materials much more professional and facilitates all of our video conferences and really has brought us up a level. So when you're seeing that good artwork coming out of NEMSIS, that's actually coming from Chris. He does an incredible job with that. In regards to the BI team, I think everyone here knows Laurel. She's also a long hauler with NEMSIS. She's really our lead developer and really oversees the vendor compliance process and has done a great job with that. Kevin also has been with us for a lot of years, and he really is our Tableau expert and really helps develop and maintains the dashboards that are provided by the TAC. And they're always being revamped to improve them based on your comments. That has been incredibly helpful. Tim and Danya, they really kind of sit in the background, but are critical to the behind the scenes work to develop and maintain the data acceptance process, the warehousing process, the data mart, moving the data into data marts for the processing of the data for reporting. Those are the two folks that really help us with that stuff in the back end. And then our statistician team, also Ming Tao he's our senior statistician. He knows the NEMSIS data better than anybody and provides and oversees the statistical analysis of that data and provides technical research support to states and to federal partners. He also manages and maintains the work of Skylar and Angela, who have joined us just this past year. Great biostatisticians that are continuing to bolster our support and provide in-depth data queries to answer very specific questions that are being brought up by federal partners and by researchers. So the fact that we have such a locked down DUA, such a conservative DUA, and Ryan's going to speak to this a little bit later today. These are the three people that make the magic happen by allowing geographic specific work to be done, by blinding the data, by reframing the data, by correlating the data and allowing that work to happen. Lots of FTE goes into that I think we need to rethink about how valuable that is. So that's a quick overview of the team. Are there any questions related to the content of our team or any of the work that we try to accomplish here at the University of Utah? All right, fantastic. Hey, Ben, I will turn it back over to you. I know we're a little bit early for the break, but I have no problem reserving more time for comments and for questions. So I'm happy to move on just a little bit early to make more time at the end of the day.
Of course. All right. Well, with that, if anyone has any questions, I think I'll probably keep an eye on the chat during the break, but we're going to take a quick break. If everyone could be back at 55 after the hour, that's 10:55 Mountain Time and 12:55 Eastern Time. Yeah, please let us know if you have any questions over the break, and we'll make sure to try and answer those either during the break or just after. And we are going to head into a presentation from Paige Wolfberg and Worth. And with that, I will turn it over to Stephen Ryan.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, everyone. And wanted to thank NEMSIS and all the folks over there for inviting us to their user conference here. And I just wanted to introduce my colleagues. My name is Ryan Stark, and I am the resident in-house HIPAA geek, is what I like to call myself. I deal with a lot of privacy and security issues on behalf of the firm, and have been helping out NEMSIS over the last, year and a half now on several projects that we've been fortunate enough to create some resources for the industry. I have with me today our all-star team. We have Matthew Konya, and he is not only an attorney, but he plays a superhero on the weekend. Matt is also an active provider. And so Matt brings that perspective. And oftentimes when we're dealing with these things, we have to remember, that ultimately these decisions at the top end affect the front end providers and affect what types of data points they have to collect. So Matt brings the whole why to everything. And we always like to bounce things off of him. And we also have with us founding partner, Steve Worth, and Steve is also a paramedic as well. So he brings a great perspective to all of this. So I invited both of these gentlemen to kind of discuss some of the issues today. And what NEMSIS asked us to do or to just, basically discuss some of the potential legal implications of bi-directional data sharing. What we mean by that is sharing information back and forth between facilities and with EMS providers, and especially sharing outcome data, because that's sort of the holy grail when it comes to determining whether or not the interventions that we perform, and the things that we're doing for our patients out in the field are actually making a difference. And we're actually, making correct diagnoses, or don't diagnose out in the field, but, assessing patients correctly. So we wanted to talk about some of the issues that have come up, and they've asked us to speak to some of those. So I'll let Steve and Matt say hello.
Hey, hello, everybody. It's great to be here, and want to thank everybody at NEMSIS for having us. I scrolled the list of distinguished attendees, recognize a lot of familiar faces, so it's great to see you all. And we're privileged and honored to help out NEMSIS. But I don't know, Ryan, you didn't warn them. This is the scary part of the program. You got 3 lawyers at once to pick on for the next hour. So we're ready for it. We're up to the challenge, and let's roll. Turn it over to Matt to say hi.
Yeah, hi everybody. As Ryan introduced me, I'm Matt. Just like to echo everything Ryan and Steve said, we're really excited to be here. And I think this is a really important thing, not only talking about EMS data, which as much as Ryan's kind of the HIPAA nerd, I think data in EMS is really interesting. And I think it's really important to kind of get the data and everything NEMSIS is working towards to make a better EMS system. And I think all of it's really important. And it's just an honor to be here and just participate in this conference.
Great. And I want to once again thank NEMSIS. And I'm going to ask Clay, Julianne, and Eric, if they're on the call, just to kind of watch any comments that come in and, as questions come up. So this is your chance. You have a captive audience of 3 lawyers here. So if there are questions that arise, and we hope that there are, this is typically in the past when we've done these sort of discussion forums, we've gotten a lot of really good questions that come through. So please type your questions into the chat bar, and we will handle those as they come up. But we wanted to kind of kick things off. First and foremost, we have a couple of polling questions. In fact, we have 4 polling questions, and we'll handle these in turn and just kind of discuss each of them as they come up. And like I said, if questions come in, folks, or if you already have things in mind right now, and have been hitting roadblocks in getting that outcome data, please let us know. Go ahead and type those into the chat bar. So with that, let's go ahead and just queue up our first polling question here. I'm going to ask, this is audience participation, and unfortunately we do not have bacon as a prize here, but there's no right answer. So that's the good news. So here's question number 1. Do you feel it would be important to have patient outcome data from hospitals to better evaluate EMS agencies to provide care to the patients? Yes, no, or maybe are your choices.
We start with the low ball questions, right, Ryan?
Yeah, exactly. This looks like notes that I used to write in elementary school, right? Check yes, no, or maybe.
Yeah.
I always hated the maybe. It's such an indecision. So we'll go ahead and tally results from that. Wait for those to come up.
Wow.
So yeah, and that's kind of what we expected here as well. I think most of you really thought it would be really important. I'm going to ask, actually, I'm going to cue this up to Matt first and foremost. Talk about it from the provider perspective and how important it is for you as the provider, to see that outcome data.
It is really important. And it's also, as much as it's important, it's also frustrating a lot of times we don't see that data. Anyone with kind of EMS field experience, anyone that has worked in the field for any amount of time realizes you get at the scene of a call, you pick up the patient, you provide treatment to that patient, you transport him to the hospital, and then ultimately you never usually hear back on how that patient progressed, what the outcome was. And it can get a little frustrating and can also hamper kind of QA and QI efforts. It's really hard to determine, am I providing the right treatments to my patients? Am I seeing the correct things? Am I reading and interpreting this 12 lead correctly? Am I giving this patient the correct medications, providing them the appropriate treatments based on their condition? Because I may be seeing one thing in the field, and then once the patient gets to the hospital, their ultimate diagnosis and their ultimate outcome is totally different than how it presented on scene. Without kind of knowing how the patient progressed and the outcome of the patient, the ultimate diagnosis and things like that, it's really hard to understand, okay, A, I treated this patient correctly. And I think B, and the more important part is, I may not have treated this patient correctly to start, but the next time I see a patient that's presenting similarly, they have the same signs, the same symptoms. I've seen this before. I know what this is. I can kind of progress in my treatment and make sure I'm providing the appropriate care to the patient at the right time. And without the data feedback from hospitals and even rehab facilities and things like that, it's really hard to know, hey, I made a difference in this patient's life, instead of I just kind of gave them a ride to the hospital and all my interventions, all my treatments really didn't help them because I wasn't seeing the correct things. So outcome data is really important in that sense, just to have the confirmation that A, you're treating patients right, B, you're seeing things correctly, and finally, everything you're doing is actually helping that patient.
And I would just jump in and add, it's a tremendous teaching tool. When I was in charge of QA, QI many years ago in my operational days, having that information to be able to sit down with the crews and say, look, here's what actually happened to the patient in the hospital. Here's what the diagnosis was. Man, it was great because it reaffirmed their skills and their abilities as well, because most of the time they got it right. Sometimes they didn't, but it allowed it then to have that teaching point where you can talk about, well, how come we didn't get it right this time? So absolutely critical. And we start off with that easy question so we get a good quick consensus that everybody can agree to, right?
That's right. Yeah, and as Steve and Matt, I think, point out, there are a lot of psychological benefits as well to our providers. Oftentimes they're stuck wondering whether or not the interventions they performed actually made a difference, whether or not they appropriately identified a STEMI and took them to the appropriate unit. So there are a number of psychological benefits, and having outcome data has strong correlation with job satisfaction in EMS, because oftentimes we don't see. And I see a question has already come in here. How do we support you in getting this outcome data? Is it pushing the hospitals to do the right thing? Yeah, number one, that's part of it. We do have a resource out there that our firm authored. It's called Imaginary Barrier. Oh, there you go. Steve has it right in front of him. He'll have to get a little closer because of the virtual background. But yeah, it's about sharing bidirectionally. And oftentimes what was happening is we were going to the hospitals trying to get that information, and they were throwing up the excuse of HIPAA. And in no way, shape, or form does HIPAA impede the hospital's ability to share that information with EMS. And that's what that paper talks about. Steve, what are your, go ahead. You look like you.
Yeah, this is such a hot topic. I heard it referenced earlier in the conference about HIPAA, hiding behind HIPAA, as we like to say. I'm convinced that hospital people really know, most of them do know they can share this information. They just don't want to be bothered. I'm sorry, I'll call it like it is. They're busy, they don't want to be bothered, and that's a problem. So one of the things we've been doing, and I think this is something that states can do and agency oversight authorities can do, is get some educational programs together. We've been doing these 2-3-hour hospital training programs where we go in and cover everything the hospital people need to know about EMS, everything from HIPAA to signatures for patients to transfer of care issues, the handoff and all that stuff. And it's amazing how enlightening that can be to the frontline nurses and others who really don't understand exactly what we do. And it really, really helps a lot. And that's one thing that can be done, I think.
Yeah, and I'll add on to that. Having the experience as a field provider, as Steve does, a lot of times I'll run into it personally where I'm asking a question of a physician, hey, we brought this patient in earlier today. Did they go to the floor? Were they ultimately discharged? What do you think is going on? And I run into it often where the physician is a little hesitant in releasing it because they believe that's a HIPAA violation. They're like, oh, that's gossiping about the patient. When no, this is part of the treatment of that patient. So there can be sharing. So I do find a lot of times kind of a mixture of what Steve said, as they just kind of don't want to be bothered, but also on the flip side, sometimes there is a misunderstanding of what they can actually release. And there's also sometimes I found, especially with EMS, where it's, oh, you're just EMS. You don't need to know the details. The patient got discharged. Don't worry about it. Whereas, no, we need to have this data. And I think hospitals also need to recognize that this feedback is important to patient care in the future.
Yeah, I think somebody made reference earlier about lawyers being a problem. And this is one area where they can be a problem, because we have found a lot of hospital and health system attorneys are ultra conservative. They're not as pragmatic as we are. And they sometimes do put up some of those roadblocks as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And, the question came through, you do believe this is part of the treatment clause? We believe it could fall under treatment. Hospital providers could use that for future treatment. It also falls under healthcare operations. Any other facility or other provider who shares a common treatment relationship with you can share back data concerning the patient, whether it be their treatment data, the outcome data, things of that nature. So really, really good question there. And yeah, it's often a matter of talking to the risk managers in the hospital and the lawyers in the hospital. I saw a question come in and, who do we have to convince here? If you live in an area too, where you have available to you a health information exchange, and they're sometimes run by a county or other organization. I know in California, they're trying to go to statewide HIE. If everybody's in that health information exchange and populating that health information exchange, we can get information back from that HIE. So I strongly encourage EMS providers, if you have the opportunity to do so, to participate in those health information exchanges.
Yeah.
Okay.
Cool.
Let's go ahead and queue up question 2 here, poll question number 2.
These get trickier as they go along here.
Okay, so question 2 is, do your EMS agencies currently obtain patient outcome data from your hospitals? Frequently for most patients, rarely and only when requested on a specific patient, only when there's a complaint investigation or lawyers lurking, or never. Feel like we need some filler music here.
Dun, 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 dun.
Who's going to be the next host of Jeopardy?
I don't know. That's a tough call.
Yeah.
Tough call.
Yeah, they keep throwing people out there. So wait for responses to be tabulated here.
Yeah. I'm waiting until they get to you, Ryan, because I figure after a few more months, they're bound to get to you.
Right.
It'll be the special HIPAA version of Jeopardy.
Oh boy, that'll be the tough one.
Yeah, exactly. So by the way, we do have almost the entire East Coast represented today. Matt is in Pennsylvania. Steve Worth is in Cape Coral, right?
Yep.
Yes. And I am in Beaufort, South Carolina. So we have everybody covered, represented here today.
We purposely don't show the nice scenery behind us. So.
Somebody chimed in and said LeVar Burton. That was the guy from
he's doing pretty good.
Yeah, that was the guy from Reading Rainbow, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And Roots.
And Roots.
Oh, right.
Yeah, that was his debut.
And a good point too. A comment came in. It says it's important that you represent that there are QA/QI initiatives, and that's the key reason. They say hospitals get the impression that it's just curiosity, not clinical need.
Right.
We need to be able to demonstrate back to the hospitals what we're doing with that data.
Yeah, and another 2 big words: patient safety, because that's something hospitals can relate to, and it's a part of their mission and requirements under accreditation to have patient safety committees and so forth, so that they can understand that side of it as well, because we want to prevent errors.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So wait
How'd we
for,
do on this poll?
let's see. Survey says,
Hmm,
okay.
interesting. So we have a lot of ways to go here.
Yeah, so the ones who said frequently, if anybody could just type into the chat, if you were one of the 15% who said frequently, how is that typically obtained, or are you participating in a health information exchange? Would be interesting to know about that. Rarely and only requested on a specific patient. That's probably what I would have guessed would be the most common answer there. And there's still 15% of you who say never, we're never getting that outcome data, which is very frustrating. And after all, this enhances population health. If we're talking about going to, the correct facility, appropriately triaging patients. And, as we see these initiatives like ET3, and they relaxed the destination requirements during the public health emergency, we're seeing a lot more emphasis on getting the patient to the right care, and actually reimbursing providers for taking them to a more low acuity setting versus going to a hospital or other facility, where we're going to incur a big hospital bill at the end of the day.
Yeah. Hey, Ryan, one of the things I still hear, I don't know if you guys still hear this, but I do run into EMS directors who occasionally say, I don't want that information. I don't know. I don't want the outcome data because it could show that we screwed up. Okay. And, my answer to that is, so what? This business is all about transparency. Everything we do in healthcare, there should be no hiding the ball. And I equate this to when drive cams came out some years ago, and for accidents and so forth, recording the actual accident. Some people were resistant to that because oh my goodness, if our ambulance went through the stop sign and hurt somebody, well, we'd be in trouble. Well, okay, well, let's resolve it now rather than after spending thousands and thousands of dollars on litigation. And we actually had a case where the police came down and looked at the drive cam video because the lady was accusing the ambulance of running the stop sign. They looked at the video and it was she who ran the stop sign and caused the accident. Case over. So, bottom line is everything we do is about accountability and transparency. And you always got to look at it from the standpoint, if that was your relative, wouldn't you want to know if there was a mistake made? We know that medical errors are the 4th leading cause of death in the United States. We want to try to limit that. So that argument seems to help.
Yeah, that's a really important point. That was one of the, go ahead, Matt.
And I was going to say, just kind of even on dovetailing onto what Steve had to say, it helps improve the agency, it helps improve the system function. But also in a case where there is litigation, if there's a hospital record out there, the attorneys are going to find it anyway. Right. Attorneys are going to subpoena not only the records of the agency, they're also going to subpoena the records of the hospital. So having the mentality of, if we get this data, now we have a record that shows that we may have made a mistake, that record's still out there. It's still going to be found. It's just the difference between the attorney subpoenaing it and getting it from your agency or subpoenaing it and getting it from the actual hospital. So it almost ends up at the same place. You might as well have that sharing of data, because at least you realize these are things that are going on in our agency and this is how we need to correct these issues.
Yeah, we've often heard that. And, some EMS agencies are reticent to marry up outcome data because they're concerned about that discrepancy showing up. Oh my gosh, horror of horrors. What if there is a discrepancy? Let me pose that to you, Steve. What would you say as counsel for that organization?
Hey, this is medicine, and reasonable minds can differ on a lot of diagnoses and things. And the bottom line is, so what? You gotta deal with it. You gotta look to see, investigate, find out, did your crew do the proper thing with what was presented to them? And again, it can be a teaching tool to help them better understand maybe the types of questions they need to be asking the patient based on what ultimately was diagnosed. So I see nothing but good come out of this in terms of having that outcomes data back to the EMS agency, even if it is a case of, you treated him for indigestion, but he had a STEMI. Well, you know what? We learn then for the next time. And when we talk to patients who are upset with their care, one of the things they say, and studies bear this out, I've read a lot of articles on it, their big concern is they don't want to have the same mistakes happen to somebody else, And that's an important motivation for why people sue and complain about EMS agencies to begin with. So, prevention, that's the key.
Yeah, that's exactly what we should be doing as providers, is digging further to try to find those discrepancies so that we can correct behavior. Can you imagine having a patient sue your organization, and it turns out we never went back and did solid QA/QI? There's a reason for these peer review statutes in states that allow us to perform these types of reviews under privilege, where we don't have to share that information, and it's so that we do correct and identify mistakes so that we can correct those actions. And oftentimes, if they go back and see a pattern or practice by an agency that hasn't been corrected, that looks much worse. It looks like the organization tried to sweep something under the rug, and that looks a lot worse in front of a jury than an organization who identified an error and said, moving forward, we're going to take the right steps to, appropriately triage this patient. Or, instead of delaying transport, we're going to transport the patient immediately instead of attempting that intervention because it wasn't making a clinical difference, in the outcome of that patient. So,
hey, Ryan, you mentioned something really important. You mentioned a lot of things of importance, but this was really important. Peer review protection laws. You want to comment on those? Are they federal, state, or what are we seeing there? Because I've been seeing more and more of them, and I think that's a good thing to consider.
Sure. A lot of agencies, you should be aware that every state has a peer review protection law. And basically, so you're going to be looking to your state law. So you should be consulting, with your attorney who's licensed in your state. And there are requirements. So, if I'm having a discussion with a provider about their PCR and, we're looking at an error, that's probably not going to fall under peer review, and what peer review protection laws enable the organization to do is protect that from being discovered in, say, litigation. We can say that it's privileged, but peer review protection laws have specific requirements. In other words, we may need to convene some sort of committee. There may need to be a medical director present. It all depends on what your state law requires, but you should know, what's required for peer review protection and make sure that you meet those strict parameters. So if you haven't done this, if you do have peer review and you conduct peer review with your medical director, you should have had a conversation with your attorney to make sure that you're meeting the requirements of your peer review protection laws. And you also need to verify that it does apply to EMS. There are specific designations for different types of providers in state laws. So I'll let Matt and Steve expound on that.
Yeah, more and more states have included EMS in those laws. And why do we have these laws? To encourage open discussion about patient care. To so that these folks don't feel concerned or frightened to talk about it, or concerned about a lawsuit. So, Matt.
Yeah, and I guess just to add on, when you look at the history of peer review protection laws, they really started out in the hospital setting. We wanted to be able to have doctors that would come forth on their own and say, hey, I may have made a mistake here. I want to submit it to a review committee. I want to have some dialogue here so we can figure out in the future how to prevent this. And states caught on and some court systems caught on. Like, this is a really good idea. We want to have doctors and other medical professionals to have the security to come forward and say, hey, I may have made a mistake. There may have been a negative patient outcome. I want to review this with others and we can figure out how to prevent this. Because at the end of the day, and Steve mentioned this, patient safety is paramount. And we want to make sure that patients are getting good, high quality healthcare. And one of the ways to do that is to kind of be able to come forward and have providers and have other healthcare professionals come forward and say, hey, there may have been a mistake. We want to prevent it in the future.
Excellent. Good comments there. So point being, outcome data can really enable us to enhance and, correct any errors that we see and enhance care for patient populations. So we shouldn't shy away from it for legal reasons, or because we have legal concerns. There are protections that are built into the law about that. And as I said before, make sure that you consult with your state licensed attorney, and they'll be able to tell you how to couch whatever review that you're conducting under peer review protection. So any other comments from you guys before we move on to the next question? Okay, good discussion there. We'll go ahead and pull up our third polling
Ryan,
question. Yeah.
Could I jump in real quick? Sorry.
Absolutely.
There is a comment from Jason Azuma in Orange County, how they're working on sharing data with the hospitals and a direct entry system. That might be an interesting one to dig into just a little bit.
Sure. So I know in Orange County, the providers in that region are participating in health information exchange. Their providers have access to the patient's almost full medical history, as long as that information's been populated into that health information exchange. And they say currently having the hospital direct enter into our system, it's not as frequent, but what can be done with a lot of these pilot programs is they've passed, requirements for healthcare organizations within that region to actually populate that data. So, imagine how amazing it would be for your providers to show up and encounter the patient, and they know immediately the patient's allergies, their medical history, and the episode was the patient is now post-ictal because they see the patient has a history of seizures. So there are health information exchanges and initiatives currently ongoing. And if you're interested in finding out more information, there's several papers that have been published about, it's called the SAFER system, that's SAFR system out in Southern California. And they did get some federal dollars to be able to fund that initiative.
Yeah, and kind of just reinforcing Ryan's point, it's kind of funny he brought this up. I was working Sunday and I had a conversation with my coworkers in EMS of kind of how these data exchange systems work and how great it would be is, let's say we get dispatched to the side of the road for an unresponsive individual. Well, as long as we have their date of birth, their last name, we can run them through the system. And even if our agency personally has never had contact with that patient, through these health information exchange systems, I can pull up their medical history. Oh, they're a diabetic. Okay, that kind of leads me down the road of why they may be there. Whereas if we don't have that information, we always play the guessing game. Well, we're going to check the blood sugar. Well, it's not diabetes. Well, could it be a seizure? Well, they don't have seizure medications. And you just kind of have to play guessing games, whereas health information exchange systems allow you to kind of narrowly focus and tailor your treatment. The minute you get in contact with that patient, you know their name and their date of birth and things like that.
Yeah, that's so important. I know Dr. Mears is going to talk about interoperability. I like to call him Dr. Interoperability because that's his big thing, and it's so important. I mean, let's face it, healthcare system is screwed up when the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. And we're still at that point today. We're getting better. What Orange County is doing is great progress. At least we're getting the data inputted, but the goal is to make all this automatic. But healthcare providers have to share information about the patient. And you all have experienced it personally. I certainly have. Go to one doctor who has your records. Those aren't shared with the other doctors in your continuum of care, So we got to fix that with interoperability. But anyway, I'll leave that to Dr. Mears to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. And these arguments that are being thrown up, HIPAA and, this is not a violation.
Screen.
Yeah, exactly. So clearly the law permits this type of data exchange, and hopefully that's where we're going to be going in the future. Unfortunately, with records, hospitals are on the electronic healthcare record and we're on the EPCR record. Oftentimes we do have issues of interoperability and data exchange. And remember too, that we all love to customize our EPCR systems, but the more customizable we become, sometimes the less interoperable we become. So we need to determine whether or not, these modifications to our systems makes us less able to integrate into the hospital system. So that should be a consideration that's on your radar as well.
Another point that was actually raised in the chat that I think is really interesting is sometimes these health information exchanges can actually return an overload of data, and it's really hard for the crews to fish through that. And I think that is an issue. I think that may be something that needs to be worked on. How can we set up these exchanges? Do we almost have an exchange where if it's the patient has just been encountered by EMS, they can run a certain query and it only returns information as past medical history, current medications, allergies, things like that. Whereas if the patient has already been transported and now they're kind of looking at the outcome data, it almost returns another report. I'm not going to sit here and claim I'm a data analysis expert and I know how these systems work, but is it something we can work towards in the future where we almost have customizable reports where, again, if it's a patient has just been encountered by EMS, date of birth, last name, I have their pertinent medical history that's important at that time. Whereas later on down the road, we get the outcome data and get the full set of how the patient outcome was and how they were treated in the hospital and everything.
Great.
Yeah, that's a great point. And, you know, the other important point here too is whenever we make changes or we integrate with other systems and we're pushing out information to providers, the point that was raised here is a good one is, you know, more is not always better. So we need to be having conversations with our providers on the field if we're implementing a new system. You know, go out and you know, be with your crews, run some calls. When I do compliance assessments for organizations, I find out so much from running calls with providers. I look at how they interact with the system and I ask them, you know, what are impediments when you're out in the field and what's frustrating you? Because sometimes we think these upgrades, you know, these fancy new upgrades are the best thing that's come out, but oftentimes providers are encountering issues with that. And you don't know that unless you're out talking to your crew members. So ultimately it comes down to the providers. We need to make sure that we have a strong connection with them.
Hey, Ryan, I'm looking at the time here. Can I change the subject a little bit
Sure.
and ask you this question? What about getting the outcome data back to the PCR? We're talking ePCRs and connectivity here. You know, is that a problem? Are there issues there? I know one of the fallacies I hear a lot is, you know, we can never change the PCR once I sign off on it. Okay. That's a bunch of malarkey. Okay. We all know that. And the point there is we have a legal duty and an ethical duty to make sure the patient's medical record is accurate today, 5 years from now. And I can remember my old days in the field. Yes, we were still using, you know, styluses and, you know, tablets. But if we had to add information, we did that 2 or 3 weeks later even, but we made it clear it was an addendum. So I guess I'm mixing things here, addendums and also outcomes data and getting that back on the PCR. What are your thoughts on that, Ryan, since you're the guru of all this stuff?
Oh, I'm not the guru of all of it, but
This stuff you are.
Yeah, right. Well, I appreciate that. No, one of the arguments that we commonly hear is, well, once my provider clicks submit and we, you know, submit that ticket to wherever it goes, QA, and then it goes on to billing, et cetera, that's it. We can't add anything else to the record. There's no law that says that. State laws generally require certain data elements within a patient care report. And, you know, there's going to be national elements that are going to be required by NEMSIS, and then states have their own requirements for certain data elements that have to be collected. Outside of that, there's the law doesn't, you know, proscribe. In other words, it doesn't prohibit you from adding additional information and augmenting that information. People say, well, what if it looks like the provider put that information as? These ePCR systems segment that data, and there's a time date stamp to every time something's added to that record, and it's going to be able to be discerned that it was hospital outcome data that was added and appended to that record. There are no prescriptions in the law. In other words, the law doesn't prohibit, you know, generally what you can add to the record. It requires certain things be in the record, but you can augment that record with other additional information, including outcome data.
Yeah, it's a living, breathing document. It's not a document, it's a whole medical record, and it's got to, you know, it's subject to change. This gets into a question here Jennifer had. I'm looking at it on the box here. What about concerns over reviewing data from the exchange for being current versus just accepting all of it as accurate? What about that? Do you accept it all? What do you do?
Go ahead, Matt.
Well, yeah, and I was just kind of thinking about this, and it kind of goes back to what I said earlier about having almost an overload of data. As much as you don't want that overload of data, you also need accurate, timely data. So is there a process, and again, I'll pitch this out to the people who are actually creating these databases, is there a process where we can make sure that if something is updated in the medical record, that update is the one that's pushed through, and we're not getting, oh, the patient is on 17 medications, but for 10 of them, they were ones that were prescribed 10 years ago for some problem they had that's since resolved. So I think it's almost looking into those databases and making sure that data is only pushing through the most relevant data. And then it also, while data is amazing and it's really helpful, there's also that human element where you have to have the providers that understand what that data is coming in and understand kind of how to interpret it, and also spur some questions. Oh, sir, I pulled your medical record. It says here that you were on chemotherapy. Are you still under treatment? just not taking that as, oh, it says they're on chemotherapy. Obviously they still are, but kind of having that field crew, that human interaction with the data to kind of sift through it to see what's still relevant and current to the patient's condition at that time.
Well, and that's a conversation, that's a consideration that you need to take into account if you do hook up with the health information exchange. And it's a conversation I think you should have with your medical director. And your medical director should be able to discern, what type of data, how recent does the data need to be in order for our providers to consider that data? Are we going to consider data maybe the past medical history over the past year for that patient, so it's not too antiquated? But that's a conversation that you have with your medical director and determine what's going to be relevant, what they believe is relevant for your providers to see.
Right. And more is better. Like Matt said, you want to know that history. You want to know, I'd rather have more information as a healthcare practitioner than less, because then I can be the judge. I can investigate and go down that rabbit hole, if you will, or down that trail and ask the patient those questions. So what about the legal aspects, Ryan, about putting that outcome data on the PCR now after it's been closed out? What about that?
Yeah, so this gets into, I saw another comment typed into the chat here, is that data received? Hopefully it would be different elements and it wouldn't change what would document. No, yeah, absolutely. Once the provider, the medic or the EMT, whomever the practitioner, the EMS practitioner is, once they submit that data, that record becomes the EMS record. Okay, so that is the record of the provider. That information that we get, the outcome data from other providers, is not going to change the information that the EMT or the medic documented. That is their record, and that is the hospital's record. If those two things are inconsistent, in other words, what the provider observed out in the field is inconsistent with what the patient was ultimately diagnosed with, those are things that we reconcile through the quality assurance and quality improvement phase and look at our protocols. But no, that does not change the data and what the EMS provider documented.
Good point.
So, all right, let's go on. And actually, I'll let you guys just kind of look at the chat window here, but let's go on to our next polling question here. I think we have 4 polling questions. So, but I'll let you guys read through the other chat messages if you want to address those in the downtime while we tabulate responses. So next polling question is, have your EMS agencies reached out to hospitals to request that they provide outcome data regularly? So yes or no?
Here's a question in the box here about developing a paper identifying what can be updated in the PCR versus what should be entered by a provider in the form of an addendum. And there's an example that's provided. If a provider misses entering a destination or type of call, can this be updated by supervisors or billing? Question mark. Answer is yes, it can be updated by non-patient care personnel if it's relating to demographic and fundamental information like that. So yeah, that's permissible, but you ought to have a policy on that to make sure it's clear what can be changed and who can change it and how that gets documented, so you don't have those situations where, oh, you're trying to change this to commit fraud or to make it look like it was a legitimate ambulance call or it wasn't. And then the other one, only the provider should be making changes or addendums to assessment, vitals, treatment, medications, et cetera. Matt, you want to comment on that part of it?
Yeah, and I think that that makes sense. And the kind of the delineated line I have is, if it directly affects patient care, that should be the primary care provider on the call. So if it's what gauge IV or what medication, that is in the purview of that lead provider on that call.
Yes.
Whereas Steve said, if it's kind of like generalized information, the crew entered 123 Main Street, the patient's address is really 321 Main Street. Happens all the time. That can be kind of changed by billing staff, QA, QI. But if it's related directly to patient care, that's when it should be that primary care provider.
And Matt, the primary diagnosis there would be dyslexia, right?
Correct.
Steve, what if we go back to the provider and they don't remember? Then what do we ask them to do?
Well, they don't remember. I mean, if they can't, you put down, hey, we don't recall. There's nothing wrong with saying that. And especially in having that documented, that you went back to them and saying, okay, this information was missing, or important aspect of it wasn't clarified as it should have been. Yeah, I mean, but again, if you get a provider who constantly says, I don't recall, I don't recall, I don't recall, sounds like you have maybe a behavioral issue there, and you want to address as part of your whole, team building approach, that everybody's responsibility is to pay attention to this stuff and to, make sure the information's accurate at the time, or if not, or if something changes, you remember something a day or two later, fix it. There's nothing wrong with that. Make the addendum, be accurate, honest, and complete. That's what we like to say all the time about documentation: accurate, honest, and complete.
I saw a really good practice at an agency recently that I was doing a compliance site visit, and they do in-house billing at their agency. And what they make the providers do is they make them sit for an entire day with one of the billing staff, and the billing staff explains what they're looking at, what they're looking for, and why. So the provider is able to see the why. They're also able to see that what they're doing on a daily basis is affecting other people within that organization and making their job more difficult sometimes. If your agency outsources your third-party billing practices, if that goes through a hard stop, like goes through QA before it goes to the billing, have the provider sit with the QA folks for a day, and just have them explain, because we always want to start with the why, as they say. The more providers are able to see the reason why they're asking for additional information or scrutinizing their information, the more apt they are to provide you with better information.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was just talking to a client the other day. They actually took their communication center and merged it with their billing department. So what an amazing idea, because you've always got these little tensions that develop between operations and communications and the billing folks. What better way than to share jobs and to learn each other's job, to gain an appreciation and empathy toward what that other person has to do. So yeah, good point.
And to just add on to that, there was a comment earlier in the chat about getting hospitals to see that it's more than just curiosity. Well, that's kind of a perfect way to do that. Invite the medical director from the local ER to maybe your QA/QI meeting. Have them talk to your QA/QI people and have that individual understand, okay, we want this data because once a month, just as you're meeting with a quality control group at your hospital, we have a monthly quality control group at the EMS agency, and we want the data so we can talk about it here and notice trends that are occurring in the agency.
Yep, absolutely. Good point, Matt. So our polling results are in, and it looks like a majority of you, slight majority of you have gone and asked for outcome data. For those of you who have answered no, I would strongly encourage that, and that you consider asking for that outcome data, and you go to them with an option. Talk to your vendors and determine whether or not there is an option to feed data back into some sort of exchange, so that you can get data back into the EPCR there. So comments, Matt, Steve?
No, sounds good. Yeah, it's an opportunity to meet with them. And, it's sort of like what the pandemic taught us. We're in the public health business, all of us. And we better know our hospital administrators. We need to work with our public health directors, all those folks, and we've certainly learned that collaboration is the key to success.
Sure, absolutely.
Hey, Ryan?
Okay. Yes.
This is Clay. Quick question related to this. Love this discussion. It's incredibly helpful. And I thought I would just say this because it would take a lot for me to type it, just because I'm not exactly sure of my question. But when agencies go to hospitals, it's related to this. I know that at the national level, you can receive a certification indicating that you are trained and have taken the necessary precautions to protect the security and the confidentiality of data. For example, FSMA, right? And I don't know if hospital certifications like J-code do this same thing. But I guess my question to you, Stephen and Matt, is: Are there any programs available for agencies that they could take or complete, and then they end up with this piece of paper that says, hey, these guys have been educated on HIPAA, data security, confidentiality. Here's their certificate from something like that. Is there anything like that to kind of dispel that very first concern, right? That the folks feel like hospitals don't need it or know how to protect it. I don't know.
Hey, Ryan, you want to take a shot at that one first?
Yeah, sure.
I threw
Well,
him under the bus.
no, not at all. Not at all.
Good question, Clay.
Yeah, that is a
Excellent.
good question. Yeah, we were just talking. I'm actually at a
Yeah.
hospital right now doing this, and my stepfather, who is the chief pharmacist here, talked about FSMA, and he has to go through those standards. There aren't requirements for EMS practitioners. There is a certification program, however, for it's called the Certified Ambulance Privacy Officer certification that's offered by the National Academy of Ambulance Compliance, that your agency's compliance or privacy officer rather can go through that program and they get an actual certification. But everybody is required within your organization to receive HIPAA training during onboarding and then periodically thereafter. So
Right.
the organization would have training records to show the hospital. Also, organizations are required to apply the same privacy and security standards that hospitals and other facilities are required to do. So you can share with them your policy manual on HIPAA. You can share with them, and you might want to redact certain portions of this. You can share with them a risk analysis that you've done, and demonstrate to them that you've complied with the same standards, because HIPAA applies in the same fashion. There isn't a specific designation to say facilities have to do this, mobile providers have to do that. Every healthcare provider who is a covered entity under that law have to go through the same standards. And if you augment those security practices with other things, like if you do pen testing, penetration testing, if you've done SOC audits and other types of audits, you can share that information. That's really the advantage, folks, of having a third party come in and look at your operations, and if you've ever
Right.
had some sort of outside certifying body and you're able to share that information with them, but you share with them, your policy manual and your risk analysis, that should be able to demonstrate to the hospital that you're complying with the same standards that they are.
Yeah, that's a real good point. And in full disclosure, we operate the DAC, which provides that Certified Ambulance Privacy Officer certification. But what surprises me is that I believe EMS in many ways is more sensitive to dealing with the security of protected health information than some of the hospitals and other healthcare organizations that we see. So that is kind of an irony there, Clay. But there is no certificate really that you can get checked off to show, other than the program Ryan's talking about. But that would be a great idea, to have a system like that to assuage those hospital people who think that we are just a bunch of ambulance drivers who don't know anything about this stuff, and that we actually give ourselves a pat on the back, are more sophisticated in many respects when it comes to the security and privacy of patient information than some of those very hospitals that we go to.
Yeah, and you want to be talking the same language when you're having that conversation with the hospital. If you're talking to their risk manager, their compliance officer, or their attorney, they may not be conversant on the specific privacy and security standards. So who you want to involve in that conversation is the hospital's privacy officer. So I would request, if you're having direct conversations with the risk manager or their attorney, say, could we get your privacy officer involved in this? And when you provide the privacy officer with that information, they should be able to interpret that you're on the same sheet of music at that point and speaking the same language.
Real good point. Great.
Matt, anything else?
I guess again, I always feel like I'm kind of dovetailing on what Steve said, but I found personally that a lot of times hospitals have less HIPAA training for their practitioners, especially nurses, than most others. I have a lot of friends who are nurses, and sometimes every so often I'll be like, when's the last time you did HIPAA training? And 9 times out of 10, I just get the look of, what's HIPAA training?
Yeah.
Well, they're not doing it yearly. And I find most EMS agencies, at least most EMS agencies I've been involved with, either as a provider in or assisting with some issues, they're usually doing it on a yearly basis. So I can't stress enough Steve's point of, a lot of times the providers, the field providers in EMS are more up on HIPAA than some of the individuals working at the hospital, just because there is somewhat of a disconnect because hospitals sometimes are focused on other issues so much that HIPAA training and what is PHI and things like that kind of get pushed to the side. And it's the onboarding process. You learn about it once and then we never talk about it again.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
That's a really good point. Yeah, I think oftentimes when they enter the facility, it becomes this magic bubble and they think that everything is
Yeah.
sealed.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, and turnover is a problem too, alluding to, talking about what Matt's mentioning. Let's face it, turnover is very high in some of these healthcare facilities, even higher than it is in EMS. And that's part of the problem too. So,
Yep.
yeah, I guess we got about 6 minutes to go.
Okay. Let's go ahead and queue up then our final polling question. What do you feel is the biggest impediment to obtaining outcome data from hospitals? And this will be informative for us as well to see, maybe where we need to partner again with NEMSIS or whomever to address this. So the hospitals hide behind HIPAA and won't share it. Hospitals are too busy to provide it. The EMS agencies don't bring enough goodies and snacks to the nursing stations, or EMS agencies don't have the time and resources to deal with. And again, this is more of a, for our own edification, internal collection practices here.
And while you're answering that, I'm looking at Clayman's profile picture and he bears an uncanny resemblance to James O. Page. So,
yeah, that's true.
He doesn't he though? Yeah, I think if
yeah.
Jim was here, he'd be very proud of everybody on this call and involved in this process, because he was certainly one who was known as the conscience of EMS and always moving the ball forward.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Just like what you all are doing here today.
Yeah, I don't see, I figured out this setting on, you can hide non-video participants in Zoom. So I clicked on that. So I only see the three of us right now.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So there's a tip for you,
All
for
right.
those of you in Zoom land. And I'll just address this sort of as well. SAMHSA is also an impediment for data sharing. It could be if the facility where you're requesting it holds themselves out as providing mental health care or substance abuse care, but oftentimes the emergency department of hospitals aren't holding themselves and aren't SAMHSA covered units. So that's another dragon to slay on a different day, but you do need to look to see whether or not they might be a Part 2 covered provider, and that might be an impediment to data sharing. So that's a really good point from Mr. Saylor. So biggest impediment, hospitals are too busy to provide it, or can't devote the resources. Yeah,
there it is.
Yep. And
true story comes out.
And that's informative for a lot of the folks that are on this call as well, because you guys are the solution providers, and the folks who are providing the solutions to enable our folks to be able to share information. And the easier, less labor intensive we can make it for both entities on both sides of that bidirectional exchange, the more apt that we're going to share that information. Other thoughts, folks? Okay, I did want to mention, I realize we're butting up against the end of our segment here. I did want to mention that Paige Wolfberg and Worth has been tasked by NEMSIS to review the most current data use agreement. And these are the data use agreements between NEMSIS and all of the state agencies. So in conjunction with that transition to version 3.5, we have been engaged to take a look at that agreement. I just wanted to give folks a heads up about that. And we are actively engaged in that.
Yeah. Hey, Clay and Julianne, and the rest of you folks, any questions that you can think of that haven't been addressed here, since we're zooming in on the last couple of minutes?
Steve, this is quite, wow, just a great presentation. I can't think of any of the questions that we hoped you'd cover that you didn't. And just the format was very, very helpful, just to kind of have the discussion roll out in this way, made it really easy to kind of follow. Julianne, or Eric, any other topics that you?
Yes, Clay, just to say, I'll echo the comment Dia put in chat, which was thanks for making this a non-lawyer-like presentation.
That's a compliment for sure.
We really appreciate it when you can break it down and explain it and have it make sense and not leave with scratching our heads wondering what it was actually determined. That's very helpful, but I do want to thank you. And then the second part is to the audience and participants. it is my intention, if Paige Wolfberg and Worth is willing to continue with efforts such as these, that if there's something that the field providers need developed, or the agencies or the vendors are interested in another product, another topic, or a play on the existing topics, let me know what they are. I said early on when I took on this project, anything I could do develop nationally to roll out to everyone was considered a huge win. And NHTSA and DOT are committed to making that happen. So please, any ideas, let me know. Otherwise, gentlemen, thank you.
Well, appreciate the kind words, Eric. And we try to keep it practical. And here's another practical tool. I don't know if you can see it, but we've got this this whole HIPAA basics for EMS practitioners, a little chart that Ryan did all the legwork on this and worked with the folks at NEMSIS, and covers all the top questions that we get from EMS practitioners. That kind of thing is getting education out to people in a simple way that's accessible is really part of our goal as well as yours. So we appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much for the opportunity, folks. It's been an honor to work with all of you and to be able to help the folks out in EMS and give back to, obviously the industry that we care so greatly about. So thank you. And thank you so much to my colleagues, Steve and Matt, for your insight. It's been great. So with that, I don't want to take any time away from our next speaker. It was a lot of fun. So we'll go ahead and cede the floor. But thank you again for the opportunity, and thanks for all the comments and questions.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for presenting. And Ryan, the next speaker is actually lunch, so it's very, you never want to be between people.
Oh, there we go.
Good thing we're not late. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I guess in Mountain Time lunch anyway. Yeah, please feel free to post additional questions in the chat. We'll post a link to the document that Stephen was holding up about HIPAA for practitioners. And then our next talk will resume here at 12:10 Mountain Time. I think that's 2:10 Eastern Time. Eric will be talking about agency and clinician operational data. If you guys could be back around then, and we will speak to you all very shortly.
Hey, good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. So you can see the slides, Ben?
Yep.
Perfect. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, so what you're going to see in this this next set of slides and presentation is a fair amount of redundancy, and we're going to blow through some of that, but I kept it in there for a purpose, and that is the different perspective that you take when you look at this from the agency level or the clinical operations level. And this is an area where we are taking a lot more interest, and I'll tell you why in just a second. So next slide, please. My federal disclosure statement. Again, I have no stock in any of the EPCR vendors that participate in NEMSIS. Next slide, please. I want to remind everybody of my NEMSIS direction, make it easier for the clinician, get rid of variation, funding for the data managers, resources in general. Focus on value, and then specifically to this presentation, agency and clinician operational value. Next slide, please. The NEMSIS facts, they don't change for this one at all. I think they're just going to get more and more ingrained into what you see, and the goal here is for you to understand what NHTSA, and that specifically means two individuals, Dave Bryson and myself, are thinking in terms of NEMSIS as we move forward. Next slide, please. So let's talk about what I heard on my early stages in March of 2019 when Jeremy Kinsman left and Dr. Kramer said, "Hey, Eric, this NEMSIS thing, I'd really like you to kind of take this over. And it's only going to be a short time. It'll only be 6 months. It'll only be 6 months. We're hiring Jeremy's position, and then we'll get you back to FICMS and NEMSAC." So you see how that worked. And I'm actually very happy that that was the case, because this is far more interesting than dealing with federal advisory committees, I can assure you. So what I heard in 2019, and this is almost a quote, and it was the TAC, specifically Dr. Mann, is only interested in research and publication. And I can tell you that that's not the case. It's not true, and it couldn't be further from the truth. However, as I go back and look at things from the early days through 2019, and I look at what I started with in terms of general information on this project, I can understand how people think that, because that's what you heard about. And really, that's a good thing. As we just learned in the last presentation, we're over 1,130 NEMSIS-based publications, of which, as I said in the first presentation, all of you have provided data and support to. So in a way, you co-authored these publications. It's what the system was designed to do. Taking it back one step further, the Safety Lou Act that authorized NEMSIS monies to be developed and put DOT sort of in the center, the bullseye of the target for doing NEMSIS. One of the focus was highway traffic safety, injury, crash, and prevention. That was the big ticket. So research was one of the cornerstones, if not the cornerstone, of why NEMSIS was born. So I want to assure you that that's publication is one part of what we do, but not all of what we do. And that nothing's done at the TAC that it isn't a Dr. Mann show, an Eric Cheney show. It isn't an NEMSIS show, an NAEMT show, that we take input from everybody all over the place at every opportunity and encourage you to keep sending things in. The University of Utah works under a federal contract. That federal contract is managed by Contracting Officer's Representative, which is Dave Bryson. He's responsible for all the budgeting piece, and myself as the A Corps or alternate Corps is responsible for all the work that Clay does. So nothing at the TAC gets done without NHTSA approval, and therefore it's important that you guys inform NHTSA of the things you want for NEMSIS, especially moving forward. Next slide, please. So we talked about the public data. So how's this data made available to requesting entities? We are getting tons and tons of requests. And since COVID, it's just ballooned to the point where they're beginning to, it's exceeding our capability for an immediate response. Our timeliness of response is now looking out like at a week or weeks, instead of, hey, we can probably get you something this week. It's pretty much always next week or the week after, depending on the request. It moves out even further. So the piece that's often difficult is not the data run, although Ming Tao and Kevin and others do just a fantastic job. The problem is often explaining what the data means. So while we can make it accessible, and there are ways of doing this as we look forward, making it even more accessible and having ease of access, the difficult piece is, how do you spend time with a person making the request to explain the difference between a call, response, a dispatch, and a transport when they think they're all the same? Or they don't understand the nuances of having a rendezvous where one ambulance shows up and another ambulance comes in and picks up the patient. Now we have 2 patient care reports for the same patient. What does that mean? All of those things are really what takes up a Herculean amount of time with some of the investigators. Next slide, please. So state dashboards. I mentioned those earlier as an excellent resource, and they are. But I also mentioned that there's some negative sides here. And one of those is, and I'll use COVID as the example, if we just had a COVID dashboard and referred everybody to the COVID dashboard, I don't know that we would have had the success in data sharing that we did during the COVID response and continuing through this COVID response. The PowerPoint that was put together, EMS by the numbers, specifically related to COVID, and looked at ILI activations along with a whole bunch of other topics associated with the COVID response. We put that out on a weekly basis. And that really made its way into so many different presentations at local, state, and national levels in so many different ways. And Dr. Kramer used it when we were focused at the federal level in presenting to HHS and ASPR and to FEMA about what was going on at the state level. So again, I come back to my comment, while the state dashboards are extremely helpful, we got to continuously pull this data out and push it to the people that need to see it so that they know that it's available. And I see that Julianne has posted that in the chat. If you haven't seen that particular PowerPoint before, it's available. Please take a look at it. Next slide, please. The HIE piece, quite honestly, ladies and gentlemen, this one's out of my league. This is why we have brought on Greg Mears, and you heard Steve Worth talk about his knowledge and have working with Greg in the past on this particular topic. So we brought him in to lead this effort. It has been, and I'll go back to the 2020 Data Summit, which we're going to talk about in more detail, very difficult to get the hospital electronic healthcare record vendors in the room to participate in some of these discussions. And I'll editorialize here, as Dr. Kramer says, for a minute. I think it's because it potentially affects the bottom line. And I hate to be that way, but I'm going to call it the way it is. We have the ability to develop something that can be done with every hospital. It's not a custom development. Every service doesn't have to pay every hospital to do the same thing. And I think that this is affecting their bottom line. And because of that, there's disinterest. I like to think that I'm wrong. We're continuing to work with them, and we're going to talk more about that in just a couple of minutes. Next slide, please. The engagement piece I mentioned the last time, just briefly, the CDC Data Hub, we meet with them monthly. And during that monthly exchange, we talk primarily about research that the CDC is interested in related to NEMSIS data. They have the NEMSIS data. There's a research request in place. So basically, if a CDC researcher wants to use NEMSIS data, national level NEMSIS data, they submit a request to the CDC. The CDC looks at it, their personnel at the data hub. Then Dr. Mann looks at it from the NEMSIS level to say, hey, look, can we actually do this with the data we have? And then I look at it from the DOT level to say, hey, look, is this going to embarrass DOT, quite frankly, NHTSA, or any of the ambulance services if this data were put out as it's proposed? And that's how we review any request to the CDC Data Hub. Surveillance is their primary area of interest. They have surveillance activities underway using NEMSIS data, and I think you're going to see that expand quite heavily over the next year. Next slide, please. The other one I wanted to mention was the ONDCP, which is the Office of National Drug Control Policy, has been looking at naloxone administration and opioid data for years now. We provide them with monthly, it happens at quarterly basis reports with specific data that they want. So the White House has been engaged in looking at the data, again, created at the clinical level. The next slide, please. So I guess my point in all this is EMS by the numbers. When you look at it, my point in all this is it works. We have a system in play we can improve upon, talked about that earlier. We're going to continuously talk about improvement, but we know we can get a report from the clinician to the national data set in 7 minutes. We just need to eliminate the barriers between that process, get a handle on submission lag, and then think about how we can disseminate that data in a way that it's useful to the people who are appropriate to receive it. Sounds easy, but it's not. Next slide. So we talked about the barrier to success earlier, not limited by technology, need resources. The important piece, and I keep coming back to this, is we need direction from the clinicians, the state medical directors, the state agencies, from the federal organizations that want the data. And the question we keep asking, or the one I keep asking, and Clay and the TAC are asking now, is what's important? And we'll talk about why. Next slide, please. So you're going to hear me talk about value, and you've already heard that resources and funding in any meeting that my boss is in or his boss is in or leadership in is the topic number one on my list and report. So we have to show value, and that value is difficult often to quantify, but it's key that you understand the individual making the request to determine what that value is. So recently in one of the meetings I had I talked about this, and one of the EMS personnel, the clinicians industry asked, what's the value to me? And I have some answers for that, and I'm working on a little kind of snappy presentation that addresses value across all levels. But here's kind of the background of the whole question. So why do you complete a patient care report? If you took your EMT basic class, you probably talked about that. If you did one I did, you talked about filling out a Maryland ambulance information bubble form with the number 2 pencil and coloring in the dots. But some of the answers were the medical director makes us, the service or agency makes us, it's a requirement for them. We need it for billing. When my county service switched over from volunteer to actually billing patients, that was a real disgruntling point for a point of contention, I should say, for our EMS personnel, because now we had to ask all the billing information, things that we didn't think were important because we were volunteers. It creates a record of the incident, which may, and this is a value piece, for the EMS personnel come in handy if they end up in court. We talked about that even back 100 years ago when I was taking my initial EMT class. And then document what we did for the patient, or in terms of violence, what they attempted or tried to do to us. So the key here is while those things are true, that mindset has to change. That's part of the value, but that's not the true value of what we're doing. Next slide, please. So what's in it for us, as I said, depends on who you are. If you're the EMS clinician, the questions I just asked, well, a lot of those are pretty important. If you're the EMS agency, some of that may or may not be important. It depends on your perspective. And then a career service may have a different perspective than a volunteer service. And if you're fire-based and you're not doing the actual transport, maybe you're providing first response and initial care at the BLS or ALS level, you may only want to capture and have certain data elements related to this specific patient care. Disposition may not be of interest to you at all. But why are you capturing that data? The state EMS agency may take a completely different tack. What was important to the individual at the clinician level may not be of any relevance whatsoever to the state, depending on the topic. And then the feds may say, well, hey, look, we're just looking at this from a surveillance perspective. The actual ambulance number that transported the patient, we don't really care. That's not important to us. So remember that perspective is key here. Next slide. So what do we need? Are these the same? Well, no, it depends on who we is what I said. So let's look at HIPAA guidance that we've just talked about as a great example. So go to the next slide, please. So there were actually 4 products that Page Wolfberg and Worth developed. And Steve held up one of them. I have the 4 of them in front of me. One of them, when we started out, was what are the HIPAA basics for EMS practitioners? This is the information to me every EMS provider in the country should know, or I should say EMS clinician should know. I'm at the individual level here. Am I covered by HIPAA? When does HIPAA apply? The things that we talked about. The next level of that is, what's the imaginary barrier? So this takes it from the individual level to the agency level, or to the county level, or whoever's going to be the one dealing with the hospital, trying to get that point across. And then we said, well, that's important, but who's going to represent the agency at the legal discussion when we have our EMS chief arguing with the hospital attorney? So we realized we need an attorney to hospital document. So they developed that one. And then there's this federal level document that also talks about releasing information. And this is the release of EMS data from NEMSIS to public health authorities. So there's one topic, HIPAA, 4 different products, all targeting 4 specific different pieces of the EMS information system puzzle. Next slide, please. So I said ET3 is another example. So if you're the Fed, other than CMS and CMMI, is the CDC really interested in ET3? Well, at this point, probably not. Probably not concerned at all. If you're the state, you're probably tracking along. You're interested, certainly. You want to make sure it's successful for your services and your service to be able to bill. But your concern is really keeping in line, making sure it's happening, helping out with any of the barriers that you can help out with, but you're not as invested as the 205 participants who jump through the process to fill out the application and are investing time and resources in meeting all the requirements to make that happen. So the other 12,000 EMS agencies in the country may be interested as well, but at this point, this is not their number one priority. Although they want to see it be successful and they want to take advantage and be able to participate in the future when that opportunity comes, it's not number one on their plate right now, certainly with everything going on. My key point for all of these topics is that while they're at different levels of priority for the different levels within EMS, they're all taking up a huge portion of NEMSIS and the NEMSIS TAC time right now. So they're a piece of everything that we're doing on a daily basis. Next slide, please. So the federal health IT plan that I mentioned, so how do we continue the integration? What's the next steps beyond just being in sync with that? Well, we're going to talk tomorrow about the first EMS data summit and lessons learned from that and things that we've gotten completed based on the work there. My plan is to sometime late this fall is to run a very kind of short, get the topics, get the pertinent information for the next EMS data summit, which I would like to do sometime in March of 2022. And it would be another meeting like we did last January. And basically we would hold it in person, but have a virtual, I'm sure we're going to be having virtual pieces to these meetings in the future. I need to point out that in January of 2020, we did not have virtual connectivity to it because that meeting was sponsored in part by the National Security Council, and we were not required. It wasn't that we were trying to limit anybody's participation, although we certainly heard that. It was simply that the National Security Council said, hey, we'll sponsor this, we'll help lead this, but we can't do teleconferences. And at the time, we were still pre-COVID, and we hadn't all bought into the whole teleconference thing the way we have today. So stand by for more information on that, and then you'll see the benefits that we got out of the first version tomorrow. Next slide, please. The federal health IT roadmap, this is just going to be, again, like my direction from Dr. Kramer and my sort of NEMSIS facts. This is what we'll be building to. This is how we have to build to be successful, because and there are still some folks out there that are saying, hey, look, we're not going to be counted in this. It's not that important to us. And if you're even remotely talking about health information exchange, if you're talking about sharing data with hospitals and receiving data from hospitals, then you need to have an understanding of this, because these are the folks that are writing the hospital standards, and we're going to have to work with them. They're not going to revise the world for us. Next slide, please. I mentioned inconsistent data sharing. You heard PWW talk about the data use agreements. Enough said on that, other than to say, this is huge for how we move forward. Next step, I'm sorry, next slide. The transparency piece I mentioned, again, trying to do everything I can possibly do, including redundantly giving you my thought process behind some of the things that we're doing and begging for your support and input. If I'm not on target, by all means, tell me. You won't hurt my feelings. Next slide, please. I mentioned engagement in the first one. Next slide, promoting bidirectional data flow. Clay talked about that. We talked about HL7, and that was one of the things that we gleaned from the first data summit. We were really spending a lot of time trying to figure out what direction we were going to have to go in for this hospital data exchange piece. How could NEMSIS data be structured? What should we use moving forward? And we were literally sitting down at one of the buildings the National Security Council uses over by the White House. And we were having this discussion, and we asked one of the leadership members from ONC, kind of, hey, here's what we're thinking. What do you think? And The comment that came back was, well, I can't tell you what's about to come out, but if I were you, I'd really look at HL7 fire. And so we didn't buy into it immediately, but we certainly started to think in that direction. And lo and behold, about a month and a half later, ONC's direction came out. And that's how we moved in the direction of HL7 fire. So again, this is about relationships. This is about being a part of the education and the development of these national plans. Next slide, please. We talked about the timeliness of data. Again, dashboards, STEMI dashboards, these things are great. They give the ability for someone to go in and look at it, but being able to put it in front of them is so much better. That timeliness, next slide, please, occurs at all levels. And this is an example of where we were looking at things by the county level during COVID and the National ILI Surveillance Dashboard. The COVID EMS by the numbers supported the dashboard, but it was just a way to get it out there for everyone to see on a daily and weekly basis, or on this one on a weekly basis. Next slide, please. We need to really focus beyond patient care. We talked about operational data. So what are some of the things that have really become important during COVID? Provider safety, the availability of PPE to the individual agency, to the individual EMS clinician, the mental and behavioral health, tracking whether or not an EMS clinician had gotten COVID. Those types of things are not patient-centric, and those types of things are not necessarily built into NEMSIS. So as we look forward to different topics, and ET3 is one of those, this is somewhat of a billing or somewhat of an outcomes topic. It's not a direct report on patient care provided, which is really what the NEMSIS focus was in the beginning. Next slide, please. The timeliness is critical. I mentioned that. You're going to hear that over and over again. Minutes and hours are what we're working on, not days, weeks, and months. And we saw that with the EMS COVID resource reporting tool. We built this out. We built this out late in the game. We really did. And we found out that it would work, that we could do it. But that adoption to something like this is critical. For it to happen, that adoption has to be very early in whatever the event is that you're trying to do it. You've got to get buy-in very quickly, that everybody is going to want to add something. And remember our goal of making it simple for the person completing the report, yet getting the details that you need to be successful. And this is an example of where we were not looking at patient-specific things. This is clearly an operational task. So NEMSIS, in my mind, and in Clay's and the TAC's mind, exceeds patient care reporting and is a part of the demographics of EMS agencies, the actual operational piece of EMS agencies. Next slide, please. I want to share some of the work that was done by the IFC on the PPE request assessment, and this goes back to variation. If you look at what the slide that I just showed you and the slide that I just showed you now are basically, one is what you have available and one is a reporting what you have available. This slide was captured on October the 15th in 2020. And this is what the IAFC was saying they needed and had used and was available for PPE based on their membership. One of the key important steps here is, although the IFC, the fire groups, the U.S. Fire Administration, and the EMS folks were all on the same calls, again, there's variation. We were collecting and reporting things different. So if the IAFC is putting this up and it says in the title, Fire and EMS Agencies PPE request, and we were putting up something different, the feds were getting confused. One of the things that's interesting is that the federal government doesn't pick up on a lot of details sometimes that they maybe should, but I will tell you from years of experience in working with them, one of the key things they look at is variation in reporting. Oh, Mr. Cheney, you said on this date and this time, you had 12,000 EMS agencies, but this date and this time you reported that you only had 11,200. Why the variation? And then they dwell on that, and you often lose whatever your request is or your argument is because of that variation. Now, the disclaimer here, and somebody's going to say this, and thank God these meetings are recorded now. I am not saying that the IAFC did anything wrong, nor am I saying that the NEMSIS TAC did anything wrong. They just took two different approaches at the same basic problem. Next slide, please. The same thing happened with the COVID resource dashboard. We were showing in actually a pretty timely manner who had the need for masks, surgical masks, gowns, isolation coveralls. Just determining what those 8 categories were going to be was quite an interesting conversation. For example, isolation coveralls really didn't come into play until we learned that FEMA had ordered like 21 tractor and trailer loads of these things, and they were making those available to services. And one of the key things in some of these after action reports, although they're not really after the event because COVID is still going on, it's coming out, is how resources were delved out from the Strategic National Stockpile. So we have the capability of reporting this data out to show what happened during the EMS COVID response. But if you'll notice, the center section is blacked out because our data use agreements were not allowed to share that specificity of the data, only with the specific state that's involved. So again, we have the resources, we have the technology, we just have to, in this case, get the data use agreements right and agree on the eliminating variation and sharing the data. Next slide, please. The ILI dashboard, and this is the last example I'll use of this. Again, we have some data that we're allowed to share, we're not allowed to share. We were tracking on a daily basis data related to ILI during COVID, and then we were putting out these weekly reports tracking the trends of activations. So next slide. What does all this mean to you? Well, the ramifications I mentioned earlier. Basically, NEMSIS is looked at as this national reporting system, and it is. And as Paige Wolfberger-Worth pointed out, it's an excellent example of what other healthcare organizations and healthcare services would love to have in place. But the key to getting this working to the next level is the elimination of that variation and the timeliness of the reporting. And that's what we're going to be focused on. So next slide, let's talk about some specific projects, which is, I think, what the primary interest here is. So I want to go back to the 2050 report done by NHTSA and DOT, because if you recall that report, and if you haven't looked at it, there's a section in there that talks about EMS, and its number one priority is to the patient and patient care. And I think that that's wrong. And I'm editorializing here. This is Eric Cheney's opinion, not NHTSA's opinion. I think 2050 missed the mark on that. I think the number one priority in EMS is to the clinicians in the field. And I think if you don't have clinicians that are mentally and physically prepared to do the job, that patient care will suffer regardless. So as I take on projects and look at projects, one of the things I look at is if it's going to impact the clinician, especially in today's environment, that goes to the top of my list. So violence against EMS clinicians is sort of at the top for me right now. It's number one in my playbook. And I just want to share a little bit of background on that project. I've talked to some of the NGOs about how this is done, and I've looked at what has been done in the past. And many of you may know about this. I will have to admit that until I had the conversation with Dia Gaynor at the SIMSO, I did not. There's a product called EMS Voluntary Event Notification, which is event. It's the EMS Voluntary Event Notification Tool. The acronym is EVENT. It was done by NAEMT. It was started in 2011, 12. It actually reports data from 2013 to 2018. And you can go online, just search NAEMT event, and you can find the tool. It's very interesting. It was done on a relatively, individual effort. Um, it has about 3 or 4 different categories of which it's focused on. One is near miss, which is akin to the fire program that's created, and then the patient safety event, and then a violence event. And I'm actually looking at the online tool right now, and basically it asks questions about when the event occurred, the state in which it occurred, the description of the event, and it has some checklists for the method of the assault, the place of the assault, the response dispatch priority, the response time range in minutes, minutes on scene, practitioner level, and several victim age, several other things. So the question is, can we take something like this, look at it in, if it was written in 2011, 2012, look at it in 2021 eyes and say, does it meet our need? If we captured this data in the way it's asked now, would it give us what we want on the back end? And then the next step for me is, if we do this, where does it go? I don't want it to be a part of NEMSIS. It's not a NEMSIS project, so to speak. However, the data captured should be consistent with NEMSIS. If we're going to capture state, we capture state in the same way. If we're going to capture agency, we capture agency in the same way. And that brings up the next question. At what level do you capture this at? Do you have the EMS personnel who report into this say, this happened to me at station X in service Y in county Z, and move on from there? Or do you limit to zip code, or do you report it out by state? Those are all questions that are going to be asked. And those are all questions that people are going to have varying opinions on. We know that for a fact. But at the end of the day, without the ability to stand in a federal meeting, Dr. Kramer doesn't have a list of, here are all the violent acts that have occurred against an EMS personnel. Right now, we rely on the folks at EMS 1. That's where a lot of the reporting, or the newspapers, or the television news, we learn about things that happen there. And that's how we try to make the argument that EMS is dealing in a more violent society, and we need resources for whatever needs to follow to make them safer, whether it's training in self-defense, body armor, so on and so forth. Those are all topics related to why we want to do this. So EMS violence is the top of my list going into next year. Akin to that is EMS injuries. There was a report in, I think it was, well, I have to go back and look at the date, that outlined injuries to EMS, and a lot of that's been done at more of the local level. Navy Fire and Emergency Services, when I was working for them, had a report that went out nationally for all the Navy bases in the country that listed the injuries to fire and EMS personnel. And I think that's another critical piece for tracking, the longevity of our personnel in the field. How are they getting hurt? Can we prevent that? We used to talk about back injuries all the time until the two-person stretchers, and then the one-person stretcher, and now we have the automatic stretchers have come into play. So there's a lot of different perspectives on that topic as well. Certainly high on my list because of the injury, because of the focus to EMS personnel, but violence is still at the top of that list. So then line of duty deaths, and NHTSA is working with folks right now to track line of duty deaths, talk about how that could be done. There's a lot of questions about what's included, what's counted as a line of duty deaths. All of these things sound simple until you start involving all the people, and all the NGOs, and all the government organizations, and all the individuals, and you want their input, but it makes it very difficult to eliminate that variation and come to consensus. The reason I'm telling you is just because it's on the list doesn't mean it'll happen fast, and it doesn't mean that it's going to happen in the way that each of the individuals who's looking at this screen now thinks it's going to happen. So always taking input from everyone on these topics, but again, where does this data reside? Is line of duty death a part of NEMSIS? I don't think the way it's designed now, but are there NEMSIS data elements that we have that are associated with that we may need to know? absolutely. EMS demographics is another one that we have been talking about with various NGOs, and you know, how to develop a list of where all the ambulance services are in the country. And about 6 months into COVID, I went to Clay one day and I said, Clay, can you please give me a map? And on the map, I want a pin of where every ambulance service in the United States is. And as naive as I was at the time, I thought that was a pretty simple request. It took him about 2 or 3 hours to get back to me, and we had about a 15-minute conversation in which I realized what I wanted wasn't going to happen. And it wasn't because they were busy, it was because that data didn't exist. And there were a lot of reasons. Everything from demographic files aren't complete, demographic files aren't updated. That specific data wasn't in a demographic file. I asked for agencies. An agency could cover a county. Did I really want stations if I was looking at who's impacted in what area? The list goes on. So that was an example of where I asked the question to get a specific product, but I didn't begin with the end in mind. I didn't really know exactly what I wanted to do with it and what was important, but I learned very quickly I was going to have to rethink it if I was going to want to get anything of value out of it. So why do we want demographics on the EMS services? Well, planning and preparedness. Certainly it would help FEMA to know where ambulance stations, even fire stations and whatever are located if we're looking at hurricane preparedness in Florida, or if we're looking at tornadoes in another area of the country. Surveillance is key for CDC and HHS, who's located in what hot zones. And then capturing things that are non-patient specific again, non-medical, like agency closures, or the availability of EMS resources in rural or frontier areas. States, HHS, and other members of the healthcare system are very interested in those types of topics, but right now we don't have the data to give them. So those are just some of the topics that I want to cover. Ambulance crashes, you would think that the DOT would have a lot of interest in those, but they do. However, specificity for those types of events have not been identified. And then finally, I just want to talk in general about operational data for a second. The operational data associated with EMS has to exceed that of patient-specific information if we're to be successful in the future, especially in gaining resources. And with that, I'm going to stop there and ask if there's any questions.
All right. Not seeing any in the chat box, but please feel free to provide any questions, or we're always happy to answer them by email. And I think Julianne mentioned as well, type any questions in the chat and we'll be sure to try and answer them at some point over the next couple days. Thank you, Eric. That starts to wrap up day one. I'm going to turn things over to Julianne for some closing remarks.
Thanks, Ben. Thank you, everyone, for being with us today. As Ben said, and as we'll say over the next couple of days as well, please include your chats either or your questions, comments, input, either through chat. You can email them to us or bring them up by unmuting yourself and asking that question as we go along. It's been a really full day for our day one of annual meeting. We've had some really great discussion, some great instruction. Tomorrow will be really heavy with HIE, data interoperability. There'll be the bulk of the day will talk about the interoperability. So come prepared for those heavy conversations, bring your questions. We touched on it a little bit today, but tomorrow we'll dig quite a bit deeper. So if there aren't any additional questions, check the chat, that looks good. Thank you everyone for being with us today and participating, and we look forward to seeing you again tomorrow. Thank you.